Extinguish your lights. Draw the curtains closed. Silence every distraction. Tonight, we journey backward through 2 millennia of deliberately obscured history to a time when October's final night meant something far more terrifying than costume parties and candy distribution. I am your guide through these shadows, and I must warn you, what commercial culture calls Halloween represents merely the sanitized remnants of rituals so psychologically profound, so deeply embedded in human consciousness, that Christianity spent centuries attempting to erase them from collective memory. Picture, if you will, the windswept hills of ancient Ireland on the eve of November. No electric lights pierce the darkness. No comforting urban noise drowns out the silence. Celtic communities gather around massive bonfires, not for celebration, but for survival. Because tonight, according to beliefs maintained across centuries, the boundary separating the living from the dead dissolves completely. And according to their traditions and testimonies, what dwells on the other side has been waiting all year to cross over. But before we descend deeper into territories where ancient terror still echoes through modern tradition, tell me, dear listeners, from what corner of the world do you join this investigation? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you exploring these mysteries as October darkness falls around you? Or perhaps in the safety of another season, believing temporal distance protects you from truths that transcend calendars? For over 1,500 years, the Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Brittany maintained meticulous oral traditions documenting their relationship with what they believed were forces inhabiting the threshold between worlds. Now, I must be clear from the outset. We're examining what people believed, what they experienced, and what they recorded, not making definitive claims about supernatural realities. These weren't primitive superstitions invented to frighten children, but sophisticated theological frameworks developed by the Druids, a priestly class whose intellectual rigor and astronomical knowledge impressed even their Roman conquerors. Tonight, we shall examine evidence preserved in medieval Irish manuscripts, including the Lebo Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, the Ectra Nerai, the Adventure of Nera, and the place name lore known as the Din Senchus. We shall draw upon the groundbreaking anthropological research of Sir James George Fraser in The Golden Bough, published in 1890, the Celtic scholarship of Dr. Anne Ross in Pagan Celtic Britain from 1967, and the meticulous historical documentation compiled by Professor Ronald Hutton in The Stations of the Sun from 1996. If you are prepared to understand how ancient rituals of genuine terror transformed into commercial spectacle, subscribe to this channel as you would accept initiation into mysteries your culture has forgotten. Activate notifications for investigations revealing the psychological sophistication our ancestors possessed appear rarely in an age preferring comfortable falsehoods to uncomfortable truths. Share this journey with those brave enough to acknowledge that perhaps our Celtic ancestors understood dimensions of human consciousness that our technological civilization has systematically blinded itself to perceiving. What we are about to examine transcends mere historical curiosity. This is archaeological excavation of belief systems so powerful they shaped civilization for millennia, frameworks for negotiating with death itself, technologies for managing collective anxiety about mortality, and ritual practices encoding psychological wisdom our modern world desperately needs but arrogantly dismisses. The evidence we shall present tonight comes from medieval monastic manuscripts preserving pre-Christian oral traditions, from archaeological excavations revealing ritual practices through material remains, from classical authors documenting Celtic customs, and from ethnographic studies recording how these ancient patterns persisted into the modern era despite centuries of suppression. We must acknowledge that our sources, particularly the medieval manuscripts, were written by Christian monks often centuries after the events they describe. They preserve traditions about pre-Christian beliefs, but we cannot verify whether they accurately describe practices as they actually occurred. What we can examine is what people believed, how those beliefs shaped behavior, and how remarkably consistent these traditions remained across vast distances and time periods. We begin with the moment when Celtic communities deliberately extinguished every flame, plunging their world into absolute darkness, and waited for what they believed were forces beyond human comprehension to manifest in the spaces between firelight and shadow. Whether those forces were objective supernatural realities, psychological phenomena, or sophisticated ritual technologies for altering consciousness, the practices themselves are well-documented historical fact. The veil, they believed, thins every year at this moment, and tonight, through rigorous historical investigation, we shall finally understand what our ancestors were truly attempting to accomplish when they stood at the threshold between October and November, between harvest and winter, between life and death itself. Prepare yourselves, steel your minds, and remember, some knowledge, once acquired, forever alters how you perceive the comfortable lies modern culture tells about its own origins. Let us descend into Samhain, where ancient Celts believed they opened doorways to the dead and created traditions that echo through every jack-o'-lantern, every costume, every Halloween celebration conducted by people who have utterly forgotten why these rituals exist. Chapter 1. Samhain, the Celtic New Year of Death. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, for it concerns the precise moment when the Celtic year ended and began, not in celebration, but in what their traditions describe as controlled terror. Samhain, pronounced Samhain, marked the transition from the light half of the year to the dark half. November 1st represented the Celtic New Year, but the celebration began at sunset on October 31st. Why? Because the Celts, like many ancient peoples, calculated days from sunset to sunset rather than midnight to midnight. Darkness came first. Light emerged from darkness. Death preceded life. This isn't arbitrary symbolism. It reflected agricultural reality in northern climates. October's end marked the final harvest, the moment when pastoral communities brought livestock down from summer pastures, slaughtered animals that couldn't be fed through winter, and prepared for months when the earth itself seemed to die. Professor Ronald Hutton, in his comprehensive study, The Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain, documents how Samhain represented the hinge of the year, when normal time suspended. He writes, Samhain was the time when the herds were brought in from pasture and the surplus livestock slaughtered. It was also New Year's Eve, when the bounds of the old year were dissolved. This much is documented historical fact, verified through multiple sources. Now we enter territory where history blends with folklore and medieval literary tradition. The Irish medieval manuscript Tochmach Etain, The Wooing of Etain, compiled in the 11th century from older oral traditions, describes Samhain as the time when all the Cid of Ireland were always open on that day. The text presents this not as metaphor, but as observable fact, that doorways to the otherworld stood physically accessible when they remained sealed during other seasons. We must remember this text was written by Christian monks preserving oral traditions, so we're examining what people believed and what stories they told, not necessarily what objectively occurred. Another medieval Irish tale, Ectra Nerai, The Adventure of Nera, preserved in the 14th century Yellow Book of Lecan, but recording much older material, provides extraordinary detail about what Celtic tradition claimed were Samhain's supernatural properties. The story describes how the warrior Nera, during Samhain celebrations at the royal fort of Cruachan, accepts a dare to place a wicker band around the ankle of a corpse hanging on the gallows outside. When Nera approaches the corpse, it speaks, requesting water. Nera carries the dead man to 3 houses seeking drink. The first 2 houses have their fires protected by specific rituals, and the corpse cannot drink. The third house has left its hearth unguarded, and there the corpse drinks, while Nera witnesses the household lying dead. After returning the corpse to the gallows, Nera discovers Cruachan destroyed, burned by beings emerging from the Cid mounds. He follows these entities into their realm, where he experiences months of time while only hours pass in the mortal world. Eventually, he learns that the destruction he witnessed was prophetic vision. It will occur the following Samhain unless the community takes protective action. This narrative wasn't mere entertainment. It encoded what the Celts considered practical theology. Samhain dissolved normal boundaries between past, present, and future. Time became non-linear. The dead could animate and speak. Beings from parallel realms could physically enter human territory. And witnessing these phenomena required no special spiritual sensitivity. Anyone abroad on Samhain night might encounter them. Whether these stories represent accurate accounts of supernatural phenomena, sophisticated psychological experiences interpreted through their theological framework, or purely literary creations, they reveal what Celtic peoples believed about this time of year and how seriously they took those beliefs. The archaeological site known as Tlactga, the Hill of Ward in County Meath, Ireland, served as what historical sources describe as the primary location for Samhain's most important ritual, the kindling of the sacred fire. The Dincentius, a corpus of Irish place name lore compiled by Christian monks, but preserving pre-Christian traditions, describes Tlactga as the site where druids gathered to kindle the first fire of winter. From this central blaze, communities throughout Ireland would relight their household hearths, symbolically connecting all families through shared sacred flame. The site exists and was clearly significant. What rituals actually occurred there remains partially speculative, reconstructed from later written sources. But here is what we can document with more certainty. Before the sacred fire could be kindled, every fire in Ireland had to be extinguished, not symbolically, completely. Understand what this meant. Fire represented the fundamental boundary between human civilization and the darkness harboring cold, predators, and death. Celtic communities lived in intimate relationship with fire's protective power. Their survival through brutal winters depended on maintaining constant flames. An extinguished hearth could mean frozen corpses by morning. Yet on this single night, they deliberately surrendered that protection. The practice appears in multiple medieval Irish sources. The Sanas Chormaich, Cormac's Glossary, a 9th century text, describes how all fires in Ireland were extinguished on Samhain Eve and were relit from the fire of Tlactga. Whether this occurred literally across the entire island or represents idealized description of ritual practice remains debated among scholars. What's clear is that fire extinguishing and rekindling held profound importance in Samhain observance. The psychological sophistication of this practice deserves recognition. Whether or not the Druids understood it in modern neurological terms, they had discovered something our culture has largely forgotten. Darkness is not merely absence of light, but presence of possibility. In absolute darkness, consciousness shifts. Sensory deprivation forces awareness inward, while simultaneously heightening perception of subtle external stimuli. The boundaries between self and other, between known and unknown, become permeable. This is documented psychological phenomenon, not speculation. The community fire extinguishing ritual served multiple functions. First, it created absolute equality. Darkness respects neither wealth nor status. The chieftain's hall and the peasant's cottage existed in identical blackness. This temporary dissolution of social hierarchy enacted Samhain's core principle. Normal order suspends when the veil between worlds grows thin. Second, the practice generated controlled collective anxiety. Imagine the psychological impact as each family watched their hearth flames die, knowing that everyone simultaneously surrendered civilization's primary protection. This shared vulnerability created profound community bonding while focusing collective consciousness on the threshold moment they were enacting. Third, the ritual acknowledged mortality in visceral terms impossible to intellectualize away. Extinguished flames served as explicit metaphor for extinguished lives. Celtic communities didn't euphemize death. They confronted it directly through practices forcing recognition that human existence flickers as briefly and precariously as firelight in darkness. Now, we must address what modern sensibilities find most disturbing: the archaeological and historical evidence suggesting that Celtic rituals may have involved human sacrifice. I must be absolutely clear about what we know versus what remains controversial scholarly debate. The Roman historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century CE in his geography, documented what he claimed were Celtic practices. They used to strike a human being, whom they had devoted to death, in the back with a sword, and then divine from his death struggle. Another classical author, Diodorus Siculus, provided additional detail in his Bibliotheca Historica. The Gauls say that the gods delight more in the slaughter of those taken in war. Now, we must approach these sources critically. Roman authors had political motivations for depicting Celts as barbaric to justify Roman conquest. However, multiple independent Roman sources describe similar practices, and some archaeological evidence does support these accounts. The bog bodies discovered throughout Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe reveal individuals who died through methods suggesting ritual killing rather than criminal violence or warfare. The most famous example, Lindo Man, discovered in Cheshire in 1984 and dating to approximately 2 BCE, shows evidence of what appears to be elaborate ritual death. Dr. Anne Ross, in her analysis published in The Life and Death of a Druid Prince in 1989, documented how the victim was struck on the head twice, garroted with a sinew cord, and had his throat cut, all before being carefully deposited in the bog. The body showed evidence of well-manicured fingernails and lack of heavy labour, suggesting high social status. His last meal included burnt bread, potentially ceremonial food. Dr. Ross and other scholars interpret this as possible evidence of ritual sacrifice, where the threefold death method may have honoured Celtic tripartite cosmology. The victim wasn't necessarily criminal or prisoner, but possibly volunteer, someone of high status, willingly accepting ritual death for community benefit. However, this interpretation remains debated. Other scholars argue the evidence is ambiguous and could represent execution, murder, or other explanations. We should acknowledge both the suggestive evidence and the significant scholarly uncertainty. What we can say is that if such practices occurred, the Celtic theological framework didn't conceive sacrifice as appeasement of angry deities in the way modern minds might imagine. Their worldview recognized that life emerged from death. Harvest required planting seeds, essentially burying potential life to generate future abundance. If the Druids extended this principle to metaphysical dimensions, offering life to death at the threshold moment when boundaries between existence and non-existence dissolved, it would have followed their internal logic about maintaining cosmic balance. Sir James George Fraser, in The Golden Bough, documented how many agricultural societies practiced ritual killing connected to seasonal transitions. Whether his specific interpretations were accurate remains debated, but the comparative evidence suggests such practices occurred across multiple cultures. The sacred fire kindled at Tlachtga after these ceremonies, according to tradition, used specific woods possessing symbolic significance. Oak associated with the Druids themselves, whose very name may derive from the word for oak. Ash, connected to healing and protection. Rowan, linked to defense against malevolent magic. The fire represented cosmic order reasserting itself after deliberate dissolution, but order transformed, renewed, carrying power generated through ritual from the previous year's ending into the new year's beginning. Historical records suggest that runners carrying torches from the sacred fire spread throughout the territories, bringing renewed flame to each darkened household. Families rekindled their hearths from this common source, symbolically reuniting the community through shared participation in the cosmic renewal Samhain enacted. The Christian Church recognized Samhain's power and spent centuries attempting to supplant it. In 835 CE, Pope Gregory IV officially moved the Feast of All Saints from May 13th to November 1st, deliberately overlaying Christian celebration onto the Samhain date. This is documented historical fact from church records. The strategy was clear. If you cannot eliminate pagan practice, colonize it with Christian meaning. All Saints' Day honored Christian martyrs and saints. All Souls' Day, established on November 2nd, commemorated all faithful departed. Together, these Christian holidays provided sanctioned framework for practices remarkably similar to pagan Samhain observances, honoring the dead, acknowledging death's reality, and maintaining connection between living and deceased. Yet the ritual patterns persisted beneath Christian overlay. Even as late as the 19th century, Scottish Highlanders maintained traditions of extinguishing household fires on Samhain Eve and rekindling them from communal bonfires. Irish communities continued practices their ancestors had performed for millennia, now justified through Christian theology, but preserving behavioral templates older than Christianity itself. Kevin Danaher, in his ethnographic study The Year in Ireland from 1972, documented how Irish rural communities in the mid-20th century still observe Samhain with practices directly descended from pre-Christian customs: communal bonfires, special foods for the dead, divination rituals, and elaborate protocols for protecting households against what they still believed were supernatural threats. The practice had lost its explicit pagan theological framework, but the behavioral pattern, encoded through generations of repetition, proved more durable than conscious belief. Contemporary Halloween retains superficial elements while abandoning functional core. Modern celebrations include bonfires, but participants have forgotten their reenacting cosmic renewal rituals. Communities still gather around flames on October 31st, ignorant that they're participating in technology their ancestors developed for managing the most terrifying threshold of the year. The darkness that must precede the flame has been completely eliminated. Modern Halloween occurs in constant illumination: streetlights, house lights, flashlights, glow sticks. The absolute blackness Celtic communities knew intimately, the darkness necessary for altered consciousness and supernatural encounters, no longer exists in industrialized societies. Contemporary neo-pagan movements attempt to recover these practices, but they face insurmountable obstacles. Light pollution eliminates true darkness. Urban noise prevents profound silence. Legal frameworks prohibit sacrificial practices. Some ancient druids may have considered essential. Perhaps most significantly, modern consciousness lacks the Celtic certainty that the veil between worlds genuinely thins, that entities actually cross over, that rituals accomplish real metaphysical work rather than serving as mere psychological theatre. But here is the question that should disturb comfortable materialist assumptions. What if the Celts were accurately observing consistent phenomena, even if their explanations were framed in supernatural terms? What if specific times and conditions genuinely create heightened permeability in consciousness, if not between literal worlds, then between different modes of perceiving reality? What if dismissing these practices as primitive superstition prevents us from accessing psychological and potentially other territories our ancestors navigated systematically? Before we venture deeper into examination of what the Celts believed crossed through open doorways, engage with our community of investigators. Does the evidence for possible human sacrifice change how you view Celtic spirituality as barbaric practice or sophisticated theology operating within different ethical framework? Comment below with your reflections. And if this evidence-based approach to pre-Christian consciousness frameworks resonates with you, share this investigation with those ready to question whether Halloween's commercialized superficiality honors or insults the profound psychological and spiritual technologies our Celtic ancestors developed. The darkness is waiting. It waits every year. And the question remains, when we light our Halloween candles, are we remembering or forgetting what the darkness contains? Chapter 2. The AOC, When Fairies Meant Terror. Listen carefully to what Irish medieval literature tells us about the beings Christianity tried to reduce to harmless folklore. The AOC, literally people of the mounds, represent entities so disturbing that even Christianized monks preserving pagan traditions couldn't completely sanitize their accounts. Modern culture has committed linguistic genocide against these beings, transforming fairy into diminutive winged creatures granting wishes and spreading pixie dust. But examine the original Celtic conception as recorded in medieval sources, and you'll discover something far more terrifying. Powerful, capricious entities possessing intelligence rivaling or exceeding human consciousness, inhabiting what Celts believed was a parallel realm that interpenetrates physical reality, emerging primarily when boundaries thin, particularly at Samhain. Now, I must be clear about what we're examining. The medieval texts that describe the AOC were written by Christian monks, often centuries after Ireland's conversion to Christianity. Whether these descriptions accurately represent pre-Christian Celtic beliefs about actual supernatural entities, or whether they're literary creations, romanticized reconstructions, or interpretations of psychological and natural phenomena, we cannot definitively establish. What we can examine is the remarkable consistency of these descriptions across multiple texts, and the persistence of related beliefs well into the modern era. The medieval Irish tale Estra Nerai, which we've already encountered, provides our most detailed account of what tradition claimed were Samhain encounters with the AOC. After Nera witnesses the prophetic destruction of Cruachan, he follows the Sid dwellers into their realm beneath the earth. There he dwells among them, takes a supernatural wife, and learns their secrets, including the planned attack on Cruachan that will occur the following Samhain unless prevented. This narrative encodes sophisticated concepts about what Celts believed were the AOC's nature. First, temporal distortion. Nera experiences what seems like months in their realm, while only hours pass in mortal Ireland. Second, these beings supposedly possess physical presence and agency. They can destroy human settlements, abduct humans, and interact materially with our world. Third, they follow their own logic and morality, neither evil nor benevolent by human standards, but operating according to alien priorities. The Sid mounds themselves. Neolithic passage tombs like Newgrange, Noath, and Douth in Ireland's Boyne Valley predate Celtic arrival by millennia. These weren't crude burial sites, but sophisticated architectural achievements. Newgrange, built around 3200 BCE, older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, demonstrates astronomical knowledge, engineering expertise, and resources requiring organized society. This is archaeological fact. When Celtic peoples encountered these ancient monuments around 500 BCE, they found structures built by vanished civilizations. The Celts developed theological frameworks explaining these sites as doorways to the otherworld, the realm they believed was inhabited by the AOC. Whether these were metaphorical doorways or literal passages through which entities could cross between realms remains their belief system, not established fact. Professor Ronald Hutton notes in The Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles from 1991 that Celtic peoples clearly distinguished between their own ancestors and the ancient builders of these monuments. The Aos weren't deceased Celts, but either the pre-Celtic Neolithic peoples transformed in memory and mythology, or supernatural beings, who, according to tradition, had always dwelt in the land. Medieval Irish literature provides consistent descriptions of what people claimed were Aos characteristics. They appear generally human-like, but subtly wrong. Descriptions emphasize unusual beauty or height. The Tyne Bo Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, describes Cid women as tall and fair, with otherworldly grace. But other accounts mention disturbing features, too perfect symmetry, unblinking eyes, or movements that seem slightly displaced from normal human kinematics. According to these traditions, the Aos wielded formidable magic, particularly related to illusion, transformation, and manipulation of perception and time. They could make humans see feasts where none existed, cause time to flow differently, cast sickness or blessing, and render themselves invisible while remaining physically present. Their behavior, as described in folklore, proved capricious and dangerous. They demanded respect and could bestow extraordinary gifts or terrible curses depending on how humans treated them. They desired human women, children, and occasionally adult males, taking them into the otherworld through processes described as abduction or seduction depending on circumstance. They dwelt beneath ancient burial mounds and hills, in an underground realm described as beautiful and terrible. Their world supposedly paralleled ours, occupying the same space, but separated by boundary that only thinned at specific times, especially Samhain. Lady Augusta Gregory, in Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland from 1920, documented Irish folklore that persisted into the early 20th century. Her interviews with rural Irish speakers revealed consistent patterns. The Cid mounds were absolutely avoided, particularly at Samhain. Speaking directly about the Aos was considered dangerous. They were referred to euphemistically as the good people, the gentry, or the fair folk, to avoid attracting hostile attention. These weren't superstitious practices maintained only by ignorant peasants. W.B. Yeats, in The Celtic Twilight from 1893, recorded testimony from educated Irish people who claimed direct experience with the Aos. One informant described encountering a procession of the gentry, travelling between mounds on Samhain night, tall figures in archaic dress, moving with inhuman grace, who vanished when directly approached. Whether these witnesses experienced genuine anomalous phenomena, misidentified natural occurrences, or interpreted psychological experiences through their cultural framework, the consistency of reports across vast temporal distances demands serious attention rather than simple dismissal. The darkest Aos tradition involved changelings. When infants exhibited unusual development, what modern medicine might diagnose as autism, developmental delays, or various syndromes, Celtic communities sometimes interpreted this as evidence that the Aos had stolen the human child and left a fairy substitute in its place. The suspected changeling would exhibit specific signs: failure to thrive, unusual appearance, strange behavior, or uncanny knowledge. Traditional tests for identifying changelings included placing the suspect near fire, feeding it unusual foods, or subjecting it to specific rituals meant to force what they believed was the fairy to reveal itself. Lady Jane Wilde, in Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland from 1887, documented practices including abandoning suspected changelings at crossroads, placing them on hot shovels, or leaving them exposed overnight, believing the Aos would reclaim their own and return the human child. These practices represent the darkest aspects of belief systems lacking modern medical knowledge. Children and vulnerable adults died because of these beliefs. However horrifying, These actions emerged from genuine theological framework, treating AOC abduction as real danger requiring desperate measures. Families believed malevolent entities had stolen their children, their responses, while tragic and unacceptable by any modern ethical standard, followed internal logic of their worldview. As late as 1895, the Clonmel changeling case in Ireland resulted in a woman's death when her husband, convinced she was a fairy substitute, attempted to force what he believed was the changeling to leave through burning and violence. The case shocked Victorian society, but revealed how deeply these beliefs persisted, even in the modern era. This represents documented historical tragedy, not folklore. Adult abduction narratives reveal different patterns in traditional stories. Medieval literature describes individuals, particularly musicians, poets, and those possessing unusual talents, being taken into fairy mounds for periods ranging from single nights to years. The Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, recorded in Scottish tradition but reflecting broader Celtic patterns, describes how Thomas of Ercildoune encountered the Queen of Elfland, who took him to her realm for what he experienced as 7 years, though only days passed in normal reality. Upon return, he supposedly possessed prophetic abilities and poetic talents he previously lacked, but could never speak lies again, bound by fairy magic to tell only truth. Similar accounts appear throughout Celtic folklore. The Irish tale of Oisin in Tir na Nog describes how the warrior Oisin travelled to the land of youth with a supernatural woman. He experienced 3 years there, but upon returning to Ireland, discovered 300 years had passed. When he dismounted from his magical horse and touched Irish soil, he instantly aged into a decrepit old man, then died. These narratives encode specific beliefs about time's behavior at threshold between realms. The other world supposedly operated on different temporal physics. Humans who entered risked temporal displacement, returning to find their entire world transformed by centuries, while they experienced only brief sojourn. Whether these stories represent actual experiences of temporal disorientation, psychological episodes interpreted through cultural frameworks, purely literary creations, or perhaps altered consciousness states that produce genuine experiences of temporal distortion, they reveal sophisticated thinking about perception, consciousness, and the malleability of subjective experience. The elaborate protocols for interacting with AOC represented what communities considered functional technologies developed through generations of documented encounters. Never eat their food, never reveal your name, always show respect, maintain iron protection, avoid disturbance of fairy mounds. Iron held particular significance. The metal was believed to repel or harm the AOC, possibly because ironworking represented human technological achievement the ancient Neolithic peoples, whoever built the seed mounds, lacked. Carrying iron nails, wearing iron rings, or placing iron objects at thresholds provided protection according to tradition. Specific herbs also supposedly offered defense. Rowan berries, yarrow and elder were hung above doorways or carried as amulets. These plants possessed folkloric associations with protection against fairy magic, passed down through generations as practical knowledge rather than abstract symbolism. Salt, representing purity and preservation, could supposedly create protective barriers when placed at thresholds. Bread and dairy products left as offerings could secure safe passage. The practice of turning clothing inside out supposedly confused fairy magic, while walking backwards or withershins, counter-sunwise, around fairy mounds courted extreme danger. These protocols weren't suggestions, but what communities transmitted as survival technologies. They taught them with deadly seriousness, because violation could supposedly result in abduction, sickness, death, or worse, being trapped between worlds, unable to fully exist in either realm. Contemporary reports of experiences near ancient sites continue. particularly from rural Ireland and Scotland. Modern witnesses describe phenomena near ancient sites: sense of presence, temporal distortion where hours pass in moments or vice versa, electronic equipment malfunction, and occasionally visual phenomena. The late Eddie Lenihan, an Irish folklorist who passed away in 2024, but spent decades documenting fairy lore, recorded numerous contemporary accounts. In his book, Meeting the Other Crowd from 2003, written with Carolyn Eve Green, he documented cases from the 1990s where people claimed direct experience with the other crowd, always using euphemistic terms, never saying fairy directly. One account describes a man who violated a fairy fort, an ancient ring fort, during construction work, and immediately fell gravely ill with no medical explanation. His recovery began only after he made reparations at the site, acknowledging the violation and requesting forgiveness from whatever might be there. Whether these represent genuine anomalous phenomena, psychological suggestion, misinterpretation of natural events, or some combination, remains debated. But the consistency of reports across vast temporal distances, from medieval manuscripts through contemporary accounts, suggests patterns demanding more serious investigation than simple dismissal as delusion or fraud. Modern Halloween has completely severed connection to AOC traditions. Contemporary culture includes fairies as cute costume options, utterly ignorant of the terror these beings supposedly inspired. Children dress as fairies carrying magic wands, embodying sanitized caricature of entities their ancestors approached with elaborate protective rituals and genuine fear. Yet the underlying pattern persists. Halloween celebrates exactly what Samhain acknowledged: the belief that boundaries between normal reality and something else grows thin. Children move through darkness, visiting houses, receiving offerings, wearing disguises, all behaviours mirroring Celtic protocols for what they considered navigating Samhain's dangerous threshold. The AOC haven't been replaced. They've been forgotten, while the behavioural patterns for managing them continue through cultural inertia. Every child trick-or-treating participates in ritual technology developed for negotiating with entities whose very existence modern culture denies. And perhaps that denial represents either liberation from harmful superstition, or alternatively, the most dangerous stance possible. The Celts, acknowledging these forces, whether real or psychological, and developing systematic frameworks for respectful relationship, maintained functional technology for navigating whatever phenomena, supernatural, psychological, sociological, or neurological, these traditions addressed. Modern culture, dismissing the framework as superstition, has lost the technology while the experiences, whatever their nature, potentially continue occurring, now interpreted as entertainment rather than meaningful engagement with forces our ancestors mapped systematically. Before we examine how Celtic communities prepared for Samhain through specific ritual practices, consider: have you experienced anything near ancient sites? Temporal strangeness, sense of presence, or phenomena your rational mind dismisses, but your deeper instincts recognize as significant? Comment below. These investigations thrive on honest testimony rather than comfortable dismissal. Subscribe if this exploration of pre-Christian consciousness frameworks reveals patterns your worldview cannot easily dismiss. Share this investigation with those ready to question whether fairies represented primitive delusion or sophisticated observation of phenomena, whether psychological, environmental, or otherwise, that our science lacks adequate frameworks for investigating. The AOC, according to tradition, are watching. They have always been watching, and on Samhain night, when believers claim the veil grows thin, the question remains: are we safer having forgotten them? Or did our ancestors' respectful fear represent wisdom we've abandoned at our peril? Chapter 3. The Dumb Supper, Dining with the Dead. Picture the scene preserved in countless ethnographic accounts from Celtic territories. A family gathered around their table on Samhain evening, sharing a meal prepared with care, but several places remain set for absent guests. Empty chairs, filled plates, poured drinks for the dead. The dumb supper tradition, practiced across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany with regional variations, represents one of Samhain's most psychologically sophisticated practices. Modern Halloween has completely forgotten this ritual, yet it encoded profound wisdom about managing grief, maintaining ancestral connections, and navigating what believers considered the permeable boundary between living and deceased. Dumb in this context derives from Old English meaning silent rather than stupid. The meal proceeded in absolute silence, creating conditions where subtle presences might manifest without being drowned in normal human noise, or at minimum, creating contemplative space for focused remembrance. Kevin Danaher's comprehensive ethnographic study, The Year in Ireland from 1972, describes Samhain dumb supper practices in detail. This is documented historical fact. Families prepared their finest food, not leftovers or minimal offerings, but genuine feasts demonstrating respect for ancestral guests. The table was set precisely, with deceased family members' favourite foods placed at their accustomed positions. Now we must distinguish what we know from what people believed. The practice itself is well documented. What we cannot verify is whether deceased consciousness actually returned to participate. Celtic families genuinely believed their deceased relatives returned on Samhain night, drawn by what they understood as the thinning veil and the living family's invitation. They believed the empty chairs would be occupied by invisible presences. They believed the food offerings would be consumed by entities requiring sustenance different from physical digestion, but nonetheless real within their theological framework. Whether these beliefs corresponded to objective reality or represented sophisticated grief ritual and psychological technology for maintaining connection with the deceased through symbolic action, the practice served profound functions for communities maintaining it across centuries. The ritual followed specific protocols that varied by region but maintained core elements. The meal preparation began in the afternoon, with specific attention to deceased relatives' preferences. If grandfather favoured particular bread, that bread was baked. If a deceased child loved certain sweets, those were prepared. The cooking itself became ritual act of remembrance and invitation. The table was laid with best linens and dishes. Candles, always an odd number, often 3 or 7, provided illumination. Deceased family members' places were set as carefully as the living's, sometimes including personal items that had belonged to them: a pipe, a shawl, a favourite cup. From the moment the family sat down until the meal concluded, absolute silence reigned. No speaking, no unnecessary sounds. This created heightened awareness of subtle environmental changes, temperature shifts, air movements, unexplained sounds, that believers interpreted as indicating spiritual presence. Family members watched the empty places for signs they believed indicated supernatural visitation. Candles flickering without draught, food that seemed disturbed, subtle impressions of presence or personality, all were noted as evidence the dead had accepted the invitation. After reasonable time, the family would quietly clear the table. The food set for the dead was sometimes buried, sometimes left outside, sometimes given to the poor. Each community had specific customs for respectfully disposing of offerings. Believers thought the spirits had consumed spiritually, if not physically. The dumb supper accomplished multiple sophisticated functions within Celtic society, functions we can verify through psychological and anthropological research regardless of supernatural beliefs. The ritual provided structured opportunity for families to acknowledge ongoing relationship with deceased members. Rather than treating death as absolute severance, the practice maintained sense of continued connection and family continuity across the boundary between life and death. By regularly honoring ancestors, communities reinforced sense of multi-generational identity. The living understood themselves as temporary custodians of family lineage, extending backward into deep past and forward into distant future. Children who participated in dumb suppers from early age grew up understanding death as transformation rather than annihilation, at least within their belief system. The practice integrated mortality into ongoing consciousness rather than treating it as terrifying aberration requiring psychological denial. Family disputes, unresolved conflicts, and guilt about deceased relatives' treatment found structured address through the ritual. The dumb supper allowed survivors to enact reconciliation, not through abstract reflection, but through ritual action, treating the deceased as capable of perceiving efforts at resolution, whether literally true or psychologically beneficial fiction. Lady Augusta Gregory's Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland preserves testimonies from Irish elders describing their Samhain dumb supper experiences. One account describes how a family maintained empty place for their son killed in an industrial accident years earlier. During one Samhain meal, they observed his chair rock slightly and felt unmistakable presence, not frightening, but comforting, suggesting he remained aware of family events and continued caring about their well-being. Whether this represented genuine supernatural manifestation, psychological projection driven by grief and expectation, or misinterpretation of natural phenomena like settling furniture or air currents, the experience clearly provided comfort and maintained connection that benefited the surviving family members. Different Celtic regions adapted the core practice to local conditions and theological frameworks. Scottish Highland traditions included placing candles in windows to guide wandering dead toward household warmth. Some Highland communities left house doors unlocked or slightly ajar during Samhain night, explicitly inviting what they believed were ancestral spirits to enter and partake of hospitality. Welsh customs involved baking soul cakes, small round breads marked with crosses, specifically for the dead. These weren't served at table but left at thresholds, crossroads, or grave sites as offerings for wandering souls who lacked living families to host them. Breton practices designated the most recently deceased family member as honoured guest, with their place set most elaborately. Breton tradition also included leaving hearth fires burning all night to provide warmth for what they believed were returning spirits. Some Irish communities practiced keening, ritual lamentation after the silent meal, creating space for emotional expression following the contemplative silence. Others included divination practices, interpreting signs at empty places as messages from the dead about family matters requiring attention. The Christian Church developed complex relationship with dumb supper traditions. Official theology rejected communication with the dead as either impossible or dangerous trafficking with demonic entities impersonating the deceased. Yet the practice proved so culturally embedded that church authorities couldn't simply prohibit it without alienating populations whose lived experience suggested deceased relatives did, in some sense, return on Samhain. The compromise involved reframing the practice within Christian theological boundaries. All Saints' Day, November 1st, and All Souls' Day, November 2nd, provided sanctioned framework for remembering and praying for the dead. Catholic theology developed concept of purgatory, intermediate state where souls requiring purification could be assisted through prayers and offerings from living faithful. This theological innovation allowed continuation of ancestral feeding practices within Christian framework. Families could maintain dumb supper traditions while understanding them as providing spiritual assistance to souls in purgatory rather than communing with potentially dangerous pagan spirits. The behavioral pattern persisted while the explanatory framework shifted. This represents documented religious history, not speculation. Modern Halloween has almost completely abandoned dumb supper practices. Contemporary culture treats death with sanitized distance. We outsource dying to hospitals, delegate grief to professional therapists, and replace sustained mourning with brief memorial services before returning to productivity-focused routines. The psychological costs of this death denial have become increasingly apparent. Modern populations exhibit elevated rates of complicated grief, existential anxiety, and terror of mortality. We've gained technological control over many aspects of dying, while losing wisdom our ancestors possessed about integrating death into ongoing consciousness of the living. The dumb supper provided technology, not metaphorical, but functional in psychological terms, for maintaining relationship with death as ongoing presence rather than absolute termination. Celtic families who practiced this ritual grew up understanding death as transformation rather than annihilation, at least within their cultural framework. Children participated in dumb suppers from early age, observing how community maintained connection to ancestors, learning that physical death didn't equal total erasure within their belief system. This cultural framework created very different psychological relationship with mortality compared to modern death phobia. Archaeological evidence from Celtic burial sites reveals elaborate grave goods, careful positioning of bodies, and construction of monuments, suggesting genuine belief in post-mortem existence requiring preparation and ongoing support from living community. The offerings left at graves throughout the year, not just at Samhain, demonstrate systematic maintenance of relationships with deceased. Food, drink, valued possessions, and ritual observances continued long after burial, treating the dead as active participants in community life despite their altered state. Whether deceased consciousness genuinely persists to receive such offerings becomes almost secondary to the psychological benefit of practices allowing survivors to enact reconciliation. The ritual provided closure, forgiveness, and resolution in ways that pure internal processing cannot always accomplish. The dumb supper allowed families to address unfinished business with the dead, to express continued love, to request forgiveness for past wrongs, to demonstrate that household affairs continued being managed appropriately. These acts carried profound therapeutic value, regardless of whether supernatural entities actually received them. This represents documented psychological reality, not speculation about metaphysics. Modern attempts to recover dumb supper practices face significant obstacles. Contemporary dining rarely involves whole families gathered in silence. Our food culture emphasizes convenience over ceremonial preparation. Most critically, the genuine belief framework supporting the practice has dissolved for most people. Modern practitioners can enact the ritual but struggle to achieve the consciousness state where deceased presences might actually manifest or be perceived if such states are possible. Yet some neo-pagan and traditional witchcraft communities maintain variants of the practice with reported experiences echoing historical accounts. Practitioners describe temperature changes, sense of presence, and occasionally more dramatic phenomena during Samhain dumb suppers. What cannot be questioned is that the practice served profound psychological, social, and potentially spiritual functions for communities, maintaining it across centuries. It provided grief technology, community cohesion mechanism, and systematic framework for navigating the most fundamental human confrontation, our own mortality, and that of those we love. Modern Halloween's closest equivalent might be the Mexican Dia de Muertos practices, maintaining similar ancestral feeding traditions. These celebrations preserve something of the Samhain spirit, honoring the dead through offerings, creating altars in homes, believing or at least enacting the belief that deceased relatives return on specific dates to receive hospitality from living descendants. The key difference Dia de Muertos remains living tradition integrated into contemporary Mexican culture, while Celtic dumb supper practices have become historical curiosities, remembered by scholars but abandoned by descendants of the communities who once practiced them with absolute seriousness. The loss represents more than cultural amnesia. It reflects systematic dismantling of technologies for managing consciousness, death, and community that our ancestors developed through millennia of careful observation, whether those technologies addressed objective spiritual realities or served purely psychological functions. Every October 31st, millions set tables for parties featuring plastic decorations and commercially purchased treats. Rarely does anyone set a place for deceased family members, observe ritual silence, or genuinely invite ancestral spirits to share the meal, or even perform secular remembrance rituals. We've retained superficial trappings while abandoning functional core. The question confronting anyone seriously examining these practices: were our ancestors deluded, maintaining elaborate rituals for communing with non-existent entities? Or did they possess frameworks for accessing consciousness dimensions, grief processing, and community cohesion that we've systematically blinded ourselves to, regardless of whether supernatural explanations were accurate? The dumb supper suggests a third possibility. Regardless of metaphysical reality, the practices served such profound psychological and social functions that their abandonment represents genuine loss. We've gained technological control over many physical domains while losing ritual technologies for navigating psychological and potentially spiritual territories our ancestors mapped systematically. Chapter 4. Guising and mumming, becoming the spirits. The costumed figures moving through darkness on Samhain night weren't children seeking candy. They were adults enacting sophisticated ritual theatre, transforming themselves into the very entities they feared, or at least believed they were manipulating the permeable boundary between human and spirit through deliberate identity dissolution. Guising, from disguising and mumming, represent practices so ancient their origins predate written records. Yet their persistence across Celtic territories, through centuries of Christian suppression, reveals psychological and potentially other functions too valuable for communities to abandon, despite official condemnation. Dr. E. Estin Evans's ethnographic research in Irish folkways, published in 1957, documents guising practices still maintained in rural Ireland during the mid-20th century. This is verified historical documentation, not folklore. Groups of young people, faces blackened with ash or concealed behind straw masks, moved from house to house, performing songs, skits, or recitations in exchange for food offerings. The performances weren't mere entertainment, they enacted specific narratives involving death, transformation, and seasonal renewal. The disguises served multiple sophisticated functions within what believers understood as Samhain's theological framework. First, and most obviously, they provided what people believed was protection through confusion. If malevolent spirits crossed through open doorways between worlds, encountering disguised humans would create uncertainty. Are these fellow spirits or humans attempting deception? This confusion might prevent harmful entities from targeting the disguised, according to tradition. But the practice operated on deeper levels than simple camouflage, levels we can verify through psychological research. The Celts understood, whether consciously or intuitively, that consciousness and identity exist in complex relationship. Wearing a mask or disguise doesn't simply conceal, it transforms. The person beneath the costume experiences altered consciousness, decreased inhibition, and access to behavioral repertoires normally suppressed by social identity. This phenomenon has neurological reality documented in contemporary research. When people wear specific costumes or adopt particular roles, measurable changes occur in cognitive processing, decision-making, and even moral judgments. The Celtic guisers weren't simply pretending to be spirits. By wearing disguises and enacting spirit-like behaviors, they were inducing altered consciousness states where boundaries between human and supernatural identity genuinely blurred, at least experientially. The mumming plays, theatrical performances enacted by geisers, preserved even more sophisticated psychological technology. The standard mumming plot, with regional variations, involved death and resurrection. A hero battles a villain. One or both die. A doctor character arrives and resurrects the fallen through magical medicine. The cycle of death and renewal completes, and the performers request payment from household audience. This wasn't random entertainment, but ritual enactment of Samhain's core meaning. Death is real, death is terrible, yet death is not final. The agricultural year dies at harvest's end. Winter brings cold death to landscape. But spring will return. Life renews. The mumming plays literalize this agricultural and metaphysical pattern through human drama. Audience participation mattered crucially. Households didn't passively watch, but engaged through responses, offerings, and sometimes participation in the performance. This community involvement transformed the play from spectacle into collective ritual. Everyone present contributed to enacting seasonal death and renewal. The payment aspect reveals another layer of complexity. Geisers weren't begging, but performing service deserving compensation. Their ritual theatre provided psychological benefit to witnessing households, enacting confrontation with death and demonstrating renewal's possibility. The food and drink offerings represented fair exchange rather than charity. But deeper theological implications existed according to tradition. Medieval sources suggest believers thought the offerings weren't just for human performers, but for the spirits they represented. By feeding disguised geisers, households symbolically fed the wandering dead and potentially dangerous AOC crossing through Samhain's open doorways. The disguise created ambiguous identity, simultaneously human performer and spiritual presence, allowing communities to maintain what they considered respectful relationships with supernatural entities through socially acceptable means. The practice of soul caking demonstrates this spiritual commerce explicitly. Groups of soulers traveled between houses singing specific songs requesting soul cakes, small round cakes marked with crosses. The exchange operated on multiple levels that believers understood. Humans received cakes, but the performance theoretically benefited souls in purgatory, in Christianized versions, or wandering spirits, in older pagan frameworks, who drew sustenance from the ritual enactment and offerings. The traditional soul-caking song, preserved in multiple regional variants, makes the exchange explicit. A soul cake, please, good missus, a soul cake. An apple, a pear, a plum or a cherry. Any good thing to make us all merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. The Christian overlay is obvious in the final line, but the practice's pagan roots show through the earlier verses. The soulers weren't simply requesting charity, they believed they were enacting service to the dead while mediating between householders and spiritual forces requiring appeasement. Regional variations reveal how communities adapted core practices to local conditions. Scottish guising emphasised aggressive demands. Performers explicitly threatened mischief if offerings proved inadequate. This pattern echoes ancient Celtic beliefs about spirits' dangerous nature when disrespected. Irish traditions involved more elaborate theatrical performances with multiple characters and complex narratives. Welsh customs included specific songs and poetry recitations, demonstrating cultural continuity through memorized traditions. The blackened faces deserve particular attention because modern culture has developed extreme sensitivity around this practice. The soot or ash applied to faces represented what Celts understood as liminality and transformation. Black symbolized the threshold between light and dark, life and death, human and spirit. It wasn't mimicking any racial or ethnic group, but invoking symbolic associations with darkness, death, and the other world. The practice predates Celtic contact with African peoples by centuries and operated within entirely different symbolic frameworks. This is documented historical and anthropological fact. Professor Ronald Hutton's comprehensive historical research in The Stations of the Sun documents face blackening in British folk customs across centuries, always associated with liminality, transformation, and supernatural association, never with racial mockery or appropriation. The disguises themselves varied from elaborate animal costumes to simple cloth masks to complex constructions using straw, leaves, and other natural materials. Some traditions involved cross-dressing, men wearing women's clothing, women dressed as men, enacting temporary social inversion, characteristic of liminal periods when believers thought normal order suspends. This gender inversion wasn't random chaos, but sophisticated recognition that Samhain represented threshold moment when all boundaries grew permeable, including those separating masculine from feminine, young from old, wealthy from poor. The disguises enacted what the date represented within their belief system. Temporary dissolution of categories normally keeping cosmic order maintained. Modern Halloween's trick-or-treating obviously descends from these practices, but with complete inversion of meaning. Contemporary children wear costumes for fun rather than what ancestors considered ritual protection. They visit houses expecting candy rather than performing services deserving compensation. They threaten tricks as playful pranks rather than invoking what believers thought were genuine consequences of dishonoring spiritual obligations. The question becomes, does this matter? If the practice continues in altered form, should we lament lost meanings? Or celebrate that children can engage playfully with traditions their ancestors approached with genuine fear? The answer depends on whether we believe the original practices served functions beyond entertainment. If guising represented merely quaint custom with no real psychological or spiritual efficacy, then modern adaptation represents harmless evolution. But if the practices encoded sophisticated technologies for managing consciousness, for negotiating with psychological forces, for maintaining community cohesion through shared ritual, then their commercialization represents genuine loss, even if supernatural explanations were inaccurate. The guising traditions suggest that identity itself is more fluid, more susceptible to environmental and behavioral manipulation than modern individualism acknowledges. We treat personal identity as stable core self, that clothing merely decorates. The Celtic practices understood identity as performance, something enacted through behavior, costume, and context rather than residing in some unchangeable essence. Modern psychological research actually supports the Celtic intuition. Context, role, and even costume significantly influence behavior and self-perception in measurable ways. The disguise creates the transformation, at least psychologically. The mask doesn't conceal identity, it enables new identity to emerge. And on Samhain, when believers thought boundaries thin and cosmic order suspends, such transformations might accomplish more than psychological effect within their worldview. They might genuinely blur boundaries between human and spirit, between mortal and immortal, between the consciousness we inhabit daily and the vaster awareness we glimpse only during threshold moments, whether those moments involve actual supernatural contact or profound psychological states our culture has forgotten how to access. Before we examine the protective symbols Celtic communities deployed against what they believed were Samhain's dangers, take a moment to reflect with our community. When you wore your last Halloween costume, did you experience any altered consciousness? Or did you remain entirely yourself beneath the disguise? Have you noticed how assuming different roles, whether through costume or professional identity or social context, genuinely changes how you think and feel? Comment below with your experiences. And if this investigation into ritual transformation resonates, share it with those questioning whether identity is the fixed essence our culture claims, or the fluid performance our ancestors understood it to be, at least experientially. The masks are waiting. They've waited for centuries. And the question remains, when you put one on, are you concealing yourself, or finally revealing something true that daily identity suppresses? Chapter 5. Jack-o'-lanterns, warding off wandering souls. The flickering candle inside a carved pumpkin glowing on contemporary porches represents distant echo of protective technology Celts believed they were deploying against genuine supernatural threats. But the original jack-o'-lanterns bore little resemblance to cheerful orange decorations that now define Halloween aesthetics. They were carved from turnips, and they were terrifying. The practice emerges from Irish and Scottish traditions involving carved root vegetables, primarily turnips and rutabagas, occasionally beets or potatoes, hollowed out to hold ember or candle. This is documented historical fact. The resulting faces, carved with crude tools into vegetables possessing irregular, gnarled surfaces, created grotesque visages far more disturbing than contemporary pumpkin jack-o'-lanterns with their standardized triangular features. Museums preserving 19th and early 20th century Irish turnip lanterns display objects that genuinely unsettle modern viewers. The turnip's lumpy, organic surface creates faces suggesting diseased or decaying flesh. The crude carving produces asymmetrical features that violate aesthetic expectations. The flickering light through irregular openings casts moving shadows, amplifying the impression of something almost alive, almost human, but fundamentally wrong. This disturbing quality was entirely intentional according to tradition. The lanterns weren't meant to cheerfully welcome trick-or-treaters, but to ward off what believers considered malevolent entities crossing through Samhain's opened doorways. The practice's origin remains obscure, predating written records, but the legend of Stingy Jack, or Jack of the Lantern, preserves folk explanation for why souls supposedly wander with lights during Samhain. Multiple versions of the tale exist, but core elements remain consistent. Jack, a notorious drunkard and trickster, encounters the devil, or in earlier pagan versions, a dangerous spirit. Through cleverness, Jack traps the entity and forces a bargain, freedom in exchange for guarantees about Jack's soul. The devil agrees never to claim Jack's soul. Eventually, Jack dies. Heaven refuses him entry due to his sinful life, but hell cannot take him either. The devil honored their bargain. Jack is condemned to wander eternally between worlds, carrying only an ember the devil mockingly provides, which Jack places inside a carved turnip to light his endless wandering. The tale encodes sophisticated theological concepts within folk narrative tradition. Jack exists in liminal state, neither saved nor damned, neither fully alive nor completely dead. His lantern light represents consciousness persisting in threshold territory, unable to find rest in either spiritual destination. He embodies the wandering dead who cannot move on, trapped in perpetual liminality. On Samhain night, when believers thought the veil thins and boundaries dissolve, Jack and entities like him supposedly approach human dwellings. The carved lanterns placed at thresholds, doorways, windows, gates, serve multiple protective functions within this theological framework. First, they create mimicry and confusion. A carved turnip with glowing face resembles wandering spirit carrying its own light. Malevolent entities encountering these lanterns might mistake them for fellow spirits, passing by without recognizing human habitation worthy of harassment, according to tradition. Second, the grotesque faces served what anthropologists call apotropaic function, warding through ugliness. Many protective traditions across cultures employ deliberately disturbing imagery to repel harmful forces. The jack-o'-lanterns supposedly transform passively dangerous thresholds into actively protected barriers through deliberate marking and illumination. Regional variations in carving techniques and placement patterns suggest communities adapted core practices to local conditions and specific supernatural threats they believed existed. Scottish traditions emphasized multiple small lanterns rather than single large one, creating what believers considered protective perimeter around households. Irish practices sometimes involved hanging lanterns from poles or trees, elevating light sources to expand what they thought was protective radius. The practice arrived in North America through Irish immigration, particularly the wave following the 1840s potato famine. Irish immigrants encountered pumpkins, Native American crops that grew larger and carved more easily than turnips. The substitution of pumpkin for turnip represents one of few instances where technological improvement didn't entirely gut ritual practice of original meaning. Early American jack-o'-lanterns retained the protective and genuinely frightening character of their turnip predecessors. Late 19th and early 20th century examples show aggressive, menacing faces designed to ward off what believers considered evil rather than welcome visitors. Only gradually through the 20th century did commercial Halloween transform jack-o'-lanterns into cheerful decorative elements, with smiling faces and cute features replacing the original disturbing visages. This transformation reflects broader pattern of how commercial culture sanitizes protective magic into harmless decoration. The jack-o'-lantern's original purpose, creating what believers thought was actual supernatural barrier against genuine spiritual threats, becomes forgotten, while the practice continues as meaningless aesthetic choice. The fire or candlelight inside the lantern deserves particular attention. The Celts understood fire as possessing inherent purifying and protective properties beyond mere illumination, at least within their belief system. Fire transforms matter, consumes corruption, and creates boundary between civilized space and surrounding darkness. The light emanating from carved face wasn't decorative, but served what believers considered actual protective function within their theological framework. The jack-o'-lantern tradition also connects to broader Celtic practices involving fire veneration and what they considered light magic. The sacred fires of Samhain, the perpetual flames maintained at religious sites, and the prohibition against extinguishing certain fires all suggest sophisticated understanding, whether accurate or not, of fire as connecting physical and spiritual dimensions. The jack-o'-lantern represents portable, domestic version of these sacred flames. Each household creates what they believe is its own protected space through deliberately placed light, enacting on small scale what the Druids supposedly accomplished with massive sacred fires, maintaining order against encroaching chaos, light against darkness, human consciousness against the vast unconscious forces surrounding it. Contemporary Halloween practice of mass-producing plastic jack-o'-lanterns with electric lights completely severs connection to original ritual technology. These objects accomplish none of the traditional functions believers attributed to them. They involve no personal labor, no vegetable transformation through carving, no actual flame, no protective intention. They're purely aesthetic, signaling participation in cultural practice, while utterly ignorant of that practice's origins and purposes. Yet the basic pattern persists, placing glowing carved faces at thresholds during late October. The behavioral template continues through cultural inertia even after all conscious understanding of its purpose has been lost. This represents both tragedy and potential. Tragedy because sophisticated protective technology, whether it actually worked or not, has been forgotten. Potential because ritual forms might retain psychological efficacy even when conscious belief is absent, or might not, depending on whether belief is necessary for psychological benefit. The jack-o'-lantern asks disturbing question. If you place carved pumpkin on your porch this Halloween, what are you actually doing? Participating in meaningless decoration, or unconsciously maintaining protective ritual whose efficacy, if it ever existed, persists regardless of your awareness. And more troublingly, if the protection supposedly works, if carved faces and threshold lights genuinely create barriers against whatever entities, psychological or otherwise, move through what some believe are thinning veils, what happens when people stop maintaining the practice? When commercial culture finally completes its transformation of Halloween into purely secular commodity exchange? When jack-o'-lanterns disappear entirely or become year-round decorative tchotchkes with no connection to specific dates? Do we lose protection our ancestors carefully maintained, or simply abandon a comforting but ultimately powerless tradition? The Celts believed that yes, the protections require maintenance, the rituals must be enacted, the barriers must be renewed, and failure to maintain them leaves communities vulnerable to forces that, in their worldview, have never stopped waiting for opportunities to cross from their realm into ours. Whether that belief reflected accurate perception of reality, sophisticated psychological understanding of how ritual maintains mental health and community cohesion, or simply cultural tradition with no functional basis, remains the persistent question we cannot definitively answer, but should not prematurely close. Chapter 6. Christian Colonization. How the Church appropriated Samhain. The strategy was brilliant in its ruthlessness. Pope Gregory IV, in the year 835 CE, made a decision that would echo through 12 centuries. He moved the Feast of All Saints from its traditional date of May 13th to November 1st. This wasn't administrative convenience. This was theological warfare against a festival the Church could not suppress through prohibition alone. Understand what the Catholic hierarchy confronted. After centuries of evangelization throughout Celtic territories, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and the northern reaches of what would become England, Christian authorities discovered that converting populations to accept Jesus Christ as Saviour proved far easier than convincing them to abandon Samhain. The historical record, preserved in ecclesiastical correspondence and regional synod documents, reveals consistent clerical frustration with populations who attended Mass on Sunday, yet maintained what the Church called pagan superstitions when October's end approached. Now I must be clear about what we actually know versus what remains speculation and folklore. The Catholic Church's strategy of overlay rather than erasure is well-documented historical fact. This approach appears explicitly in correspondence between missionary bishops and Rome throughout the 6th through 9th centuries. Rather than demanding immediate abandonment of established cultural practices, Church authorities created Christian alternatives that preserved behavioral patterns while redirecting theological interpretations. This is not speculation. We have the letters. We have the synod records. We have papal decrees explaining this strategy in explicit terms. What we cannot verify with the same certainty is whether Samhain actually involved the supernatural phenomena described in medieval Irish literature. The texts we examined earlier, the Echtra Narai, the Tain Bo Coailnge, and the Din Senchas, were all written by Christian monks, often centuries after Ireland's conversion to Christianity. These manuscripts preserve traditions about pre-Christian beliefs, but whether they accurately describe practices as they actually occurred or represent romanticized reconstructions of a pagan past, already fading from living memory, remains scholarly debate. The monks who recorded these stories were Christians writing for Christian audiences, often with their own theological and political agendas. We should appreciate these texts as invaluable windows into how medieval Irish Christians understood their pre-Christian past, but we must acknowledge the historical distance and religious conversion that separated these writers from the practices they described. Pope Gregory III had initially established All Saints' Day in Rome during the 730s, dedicating a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica to all saints and martyrs. But Gregory IV's decision to mandate its observance throughout the Carolingian Empire on November 1st created direct competition with Samhain. The theological logic was sophisticated. If Celtic peoples insisted on gathering at summer's end to honour the dead and acknowledge death's reality, the Church would provide a sanctioned Christian framework for exactly these activities. The documented historical strategy was this: acknowledge the human psychological need driving the practice, then redirect it toward Christian theological ends. People wanted to honour deceased loved ones. The Church said yes, honour them, but honour them as souls awaiting resurrection, rather than as potentially dangerous spirits requiring appeasement. People wanted to acknowledge death's reality and their own mortality. The Church said yes, acknowledge it, but understand death as transition to judgment and potential salvation, rather than as entrance to some ambiguous otherworld beneath fairy mounds. All Saints' Day, Solemnitas Omnium Sanctorum in Latin, honoured Christian martyrs and saints, those whose holy lives had earned them immediate entrance to heaven. This celebration had existed since the 4th century, but on various dates in different regions. By moving it to November 1st and making it a universal feast of obligation, the Church created a Christian alternative to Samhain's themes of honouring the powerful dead and seeking their intercession. But All Saints' Day alone couldn't fully address the practices embedded in Samhain traditions. The theological problem was this: most deceased Christians weren't saints. They were ordinary believers who had died in God's grace, but still carried the temporal consequences of their sins. What about them? Where did they fit in this new Christian framework overlaying Celtic ancestor veneration? The answer came through the development and popularization of purgatory doctrine. Now, purgatory as a formal theological concept developed gradually over centuries. Early church fathers, including Augustine of Hippo, discussed the idea of post-mortem purification. But it was during the medieval period, precisely when the Church was evangelizing Celtic territories and confronting ancestor veneration practices, that purgatory became systematically developed as official doctrine. This represents documented historical fact. We can trace purgatory's theological development through church writings, its formal articulation at councils, and its eventual definition at the Council of Florence in 1439. Whether souls actually experience purgatory as described is obviously a matter of faith rather than historical verification. But what is historically verifiable is that the Church strategically developed and emphasized purgatory doctrine in regions where pre-Christian practices of feeding and honoring the dead proved most resistant to suppression. The genius of the strategy becomes apparent when you understand what purgatory doctrine accomplished. It allowed continuation of nearly all the behavioral patterns associated with Celtic ancestor veneration while completely reframing their theological meaning. Under purgatory doctrine, the living could still help the dead. Prayers, masses, almsgiving, and other good works performed by living Christians could reduce the temporal punishment souls endured in purgatory, hastening their eventual entrance into heaven. This created Christian justification for practices remarkably similar to the dumb supper traditions we examined earlier. Families could maintain places for deceased relatives during November feasts. They could prepare special foods and perform ritual actions intended to benefit the dead. But now, these practices served Christian theological ends, assisting souls in purgatory rather than feeding potentially dangerous ancestral spirits or appeasing the AOC. The Church established November 2nd as All Souls' Day, Commemoratio Omnium Fidelium Defunctorum, specifically dedicated to praying for all faithful departed currently in purgatory. Historical records from the 11th century document how Odilo, the abbot of Cluny, formally established this observance for all Cluniac monasteries in 998 CE. The practice spread rapidly throughout Christian Europe, and by the 13th century, it was nearly universal. Together, All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd created a Christian framework that directly competed with and gradually absorbed Samhain traditions. The 3-day period from October 31st through November 2nd became known as All Hallowtide, and it preserved the essential structure of Samhain, a threshold time when the living acknowledged, honoured, and maintained connection with the dead, but now within Christian theological boundaries. The soul cake tradition demonstrates this syncretism beautifully. Historical records and ethnographic evidence document how, throughout Britain and Ireland, groups of soulers travelled door to door on All Souls' Eve and All Souls' Day, singing songs and receiving small cakes marked with crosses in exchange for prayers for the dead. The practice is well documented in church records, folk song collections, and later ethnographic studies. These are verifiable historical facts, not speculation. The traditional songs make the exchange explicit. One version, recorded in multiple regional variants, goes, "A soul, a soul, a soul cake. Please, good missus, a soul cake. An apple, a pear, a plum, or a cherry. Any good thing to make us all merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all." The soulers weren't merely begging. They were offering a service. Their prayers would benefit the souls of the householder's deceased relatives, suffering in purgatory. The soul cakes represented fair payment for this spiritual labour. Now here is where we must distinguish historical fact from folkloric interpretation. The documented historical practice involved Christian prayers for Christian souls in purgatory. That much is certain from church records and written accounts. But many folklorists, particularly those writing during the 19th and early 20th century Romantic nationalism period, interpreted soul caking as a thinly Christianized veneer over older pagan practices of offering food to wandering spirits and the Isle Sea. This interpretation may be correct, but we should acknowledge it as scholarly theory rather than documented fact. The behavioural similarity between Christian soul caking and hypothetical pagan offerings to spirits is suggestive but not conclusive proof of direct descent. What we can say with confidence is this: the Church's strategy of appropriation rather than prohibition proved remarkably successful in most Celtic regions. Rather than creating martyrs by forcing populations to choose between their ancestral traditions and Christianity, Church authorities allowed people to maintain familiar practices while gradually redirecting their understanding of what those practices accomplished. The resistance to Christianization varied significantly by region and period. In Ireland, conversion proceeded relatively peacefully from the 5th century onward, with surprisingly little documented violent conflict. Irish monks themselves became some of the most enthusiastic preservers of pre-Christian literature and traditions, writing down the very stories we've examined in this investigation. Whether this preservation represents accurate transmission of ancient beliefs or creative medieval reconstruction remains debated among scholars. Scottish Highlands maintained pre-Christian practices more openly and for longer periods. Church authorities in Scotland complained well into the 17th century about populations maintaining superstitious observances at Samhain. Historical records document how Highland communities continued extinguishing and rekindling household fires at November's beginning, consulting with individuals possessing reputation for supernatural knowledge, and maintaining elaborate protocols for protecting against fairy abduction. All practices the Church officially condemned, but couldn't effectively suppress. Wales presents similar patterns. Folk customs preserved in Welsh language sources and later collected by antiquarians reveal how Christian overlay coexisted with older patterns well into the modern era. The practice of coelcerth, building great bonfires on hilltops during late October and early November, continued for centuries after Wales' official Christianization. Families wrote their names on stones and threw them into the fire, then searched for them the next morning. Finding your stone intact meant you would survive the coming year. Failing to find it, or finding it broken, meant death before next Samhain. Church records condemn this practice as superstitious divination, yet it persisted, suggesting populations maintained dual consciousness, officially Christian, yet practically retaining older frameworks for managing anxiety about mortality. Brittany in France maintained perhaps the strongest continuity with pre-Christian Celtic practices. The Breton language, closely related to Welsh and Cornish, preserved vast amounts of folkloric material. The Ankou, the Breton personification of death, figured prominently in Samhain traditions. Folklore describes the Ankou as skeletal figure driving a cart to collect souls of those destined to die in the coming year. This figure appears in church artwork throughout Brittany, suggesting complex negotiation between Christian and pre-Christian frameworks rather than simple replacement of one by the other. The question of human sacrifice in Celtic rituals, which we touched upon earlier, requires additional clarification here. Roman authors, including Julius Caesar, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus, documented human sacrifice among Celtic peoples. These are historical sources, though we must acknowledge Roman authors had political motivations for depicting Celts as barbaric. Archaeological evidence, including bog bodies, particularly Lindoman discovered in 1984, suggests ritual killing did occur in ancient Celtic contexts. The threefold death, evident in Lindoman, struck on the head, garroted, and throat cut, matches descriptions in medieval Irish literature of ritual execution. However, whether these practices continued up to Christianization and whether they occurred specifically at Samhain remains scholarly debate rather than established fact. No contemporary Christian sources from the period of Celtic evangelization explicitly document ongoing human sacrifice at Samhain. This could mean the practice had already ceased before large-scale Christianization began, or it could mean Christian authorities were reluctant to document practices they were attempting to suppress. We should acknowledge both the suggestive evidence and the significant uncertainty rather than presenting either position as definitively established. What the Church definitely did suppress, with documented determination, was Druidic authority. The Druids, the priestly class of Celtic society, possessed extensive knowledge, legal expertise, medical skill, astronomical understanding, and religious authority. They also represented direct competition to Christian clerical authority. Historical records document systematic efforts to eliminate Druidic institutions throughout Christianized Celtic territories. The knowledge the Druids possessed, transmitted orally across generations, was either recorded by Christian monks and thus filtered through Christian perspectives, or lost entirely. The historical irony is profound. The very Christian monks who worked to eliminate Druidic religion also became the primary preservers of information about pre-Christian Celtic beliefs. Without their manuscript compilations, we would know almost nothing about ancient Celtic theology and practice. But precisely because they were Christian monks, writing centuries after the events they described, with their own religious frameworks and often political agendas, we cannot uncritically accept their accounts as objective history. Professor Ronald Hutton, whose work we've referenced throughout this investigation, makes this point repeatedly in his scholarship. Hutton emphasizes how surprisingly little we actually know with certainty about pre-Christian Celtic religious practices. The medieval Irish literary traditions are invaluable sources, but they're sources written by Christians about a pre-Christian past, filtered through centuries of oral transmission, recorded with medieval concerns and perspectives. We should appreciate these texts for what they are: extraordinary cultural treasures offering windows into how medieval Celtic Christians understood their ancestors' beliefs, while acknowledging they may not represent entirely accurate accounts of those ancient practices. The strategy of Christian appropriation reached perhaps its most sophisticated expression in the architectural colonization of sacred sites. Throughout Celtic territories, Christian churches were deliberately constructed on or immediately adjacent to pre-Christian sacred locations. Hilltops that had hosted Samhain bonfires received Christian chapels. Sid mounds associated with the Aos Sea were consecrated with crosses or had churches built nearby. Holy wells that pre-Christian populations had venerated for healing properties were rededicated to Christian saints. This practice is historically documented through archaeological evidence, architectural records, and the church's own foundation traditions. Many churches throughout Ireland, Scotland, and Wales explicitly acknowledge they occupy pre-Christian sacred sites. The strategy accomplished multiple goals. It claimed sacred geography for Christianity. It allowed populations to continue visiting locations they considered holy while redirecting the theological framework. And it physically asserted Christian authority over landscape previously dominated by pagan associations. The church's appropriation of Samhain succeeded so thoroughly that most people today, even those who celebrate Halloween, have no conscious awareness they're participating in traditions with pre-Christian Celtic origins. All Saints' Day remains an important feast in Catholic, Anglican, and Orthodox churches. All Souls' Day continues to be observed with masses and prayers for the dead. The behavioural patterns persist, honouring deceased loved ones at summer's end. But the theological framework has been so completely Christianised that the original pagan context survives primarily in academic scholarship and neo-pagan revival movements. Yet beneath the Christian overlay, if you know what to observe, the older patterns remain visible. The timing of All-Hallowtide at the transition between light and dark halves of the year preserves Samhain's liminal positioning. The emphasis on death, mortality, and maintaining connection with the deceased echoes pre-Christian concerns. The special foods prepared, the candles lit, the gatherings held, all mirror older traditions, even when consciously understood in Christian terms. Contemporary Catholic theologians sometimes acknowledge this continuity. Rather than denying Christianity absorbed and reframed pre-Christian practices, many argue this demonstrates Christianity's genius for honouring legitimate human psychological and spiritual needs while directing them toward truth. The human need to honour the dead and acknowledge mortality's reality doesn't disappear when people accept Christian faith. The Church recognised these needs as legitimate and provided Christian frameworks for addressing them. From another perspective, scholars of religious syncretism point out how pre-Christian patterns proved so durable they influenced Christianity itself. The veneration of saints, while having Mediterranean Christian origins, took on distinctively Celtic characteristics in Christianised Celtic regions. Irish, Scottish, and Welsh saints often possess attributes and stories remarkably similar to pre-Christian deities and heroes. St. Brigid, for example, shares many characteristics with the pagan goddess Brigid, to the point where scholars debate whether Christianity simply renamed an existing figure, or whether medieval hagiographers deliberately emphasize similarities to ease conversion. The question of whether any supernatural phenomena actually occurred, whether the veil genuinely thinned, whether spirits crossed over, whether offerings to the dead accomplished real metaphysical work, obviously cannot be answered through historical investigation. History can document what people believed and what practices they maintained. It cannot verify or falsify claims about spiritual realities. What we can say is this: millions of people across many centuries conducted their lives as though these spiritual realities were genuine. They structured their year around Samhain. They performed elaborate rituals with absolute seriousness. They transmitted complex knowledge across generations. They experienced phenomena they interpreted as confirming their beliefs. Whether these experiences represented accurate perception of objective spiritual realities psychologically generated subjective experiences, or some complex interaction between consciousness and world that our current frameworks inadequately conceptualize, remains an open question. The Church's successful appropriation of Samhain demonstrates both the flexibility of religious traditions and the persistence of human needs those traditions address. We need frameworks for acknowledging mortality. We need rituals for maintaining connection with deceased loved ones. We need communal practices that allow us to confront our deepest fears and anxieties within supportive structures. We need regular moments to step outside ordinary time and consider ultimate questions about existence, meaning, and what lies beyond death. Samhain addressed these needs within a pre-Christian Celtic framework. All Hallowtide addresses them within a Christian framework. Modern secular Halloween addresses them, however inadequately, within a commercial entertainment framework. The needs persist across radical changes in belief systems because they're fundamental to human consciousness. Before we move forward into examining how Victorian spiritualism transformed Halloween yet again, take a moment to reflect on this extraordinary process of religious appropriation. The Church didn't destroy Samhain. It couldn't. Instead, it absorbed Samhain, reframed it, Christianized it, and ultimately transformed it so thoroughly that most people celebrating All Saints' Day have no conscious awareness of pre-Christian origins. That represents either successful evangelization or cultural imperialism, depending on your perspective. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Does the Church's strategy of appropriation rather than destruction represent respectful engagement with human needs? Or does it constitute cultural genocide against Celtic spiritual traditions? And consider this. By preserving behavioral patterns while changing theological interpretations, did Christianity actually eliminate Samhain, or did it ensure Samhain's survival in modified form? If this investigation into religious syncretism and cultural transformation resonates with you, share it with those interested in how traditions evolve, how practices persist, even as meanings shift, and how what we call Halloween today carries layers of significance most celebrants never consciously recognize. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey through the shadows, where history, folklore, and the fundamental human confrontation with mortality intertwine in patterns more complex than simple narratives of progress or decline can capture. The appropriation succeeded, the traditions transformed, and now we must examine how Halloween, already once transformed from pagan festival to Christian holy day, would undergo yet another radical transformation during the 19th century, when spiritualism swept through Western culture, and November's beginning became the season for attempting direct communication with the dead through new technologies our ancestors never imagined. Chapter 7. Victorian Spiritualism. When Halloween became séance season, the wrappings began on March 31st, 1848, in a small wooden house in Hydesville, New York. Two young sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, claimed to have established communication with a spirit through a code of knocks. 1 knock for no, 2 for yes, 3 for uncertain. The spirit identified itself as a murdered peddler whose body lay buried in the cellar. Within months, the Fox sisters became international celebrities. Within years, spiritualism had exploded into a religious and cultural movement that would reshape how Western culture approached death, the afterlife, and the possibility of communication between the living and the deceased. Now we must be absolutely clear about what we're examining here. The Fox sisters later confessed their spirit communications were fraudulent, produced through deliberate joint cracking and other tricks. Margaret Fox publicly demonstrated these techniques in 1888, though she later recanted her confession under pressure from spiritualist believers. Whether the original phenomena were genuine and only later became deliberately faked or were fraudulent from the beginning remains debated. What is historically indisputable is that regardless of the Fox sisters' authenticity, they catalyzed a massive cultural movement that would profoundly influence how Halloween was understood and celebrated. Spiritualism, as a formalized belief system, held that the dead continue to exist in spirit form and can communicate with the living through mediums, individuals possessing special sensitivity to spiritual presences. The movement emerged during a period of profound cultural anxiety about death and the afterlife. Traditional Christian certainties about heaven, hell, and judgment were being challenged by scientific materialism, biblical criticism, and evolutionary theory. Spiritualism offered an apparently scientific approach to questions about life after death, claiming empirical evidence of survival through observable phenomena, table turning, automatic writing, spirit photography, trumpet seances, and full-form materializations. The movement grew with extraordinary speed. By the 1850s, thousands of spiritualist circles operated throughout the United States and Britain. By the 1870s, millions of people in Europe and America identified as spiritualists or attended seances. The appeal crossed class boundaries. Working-class families held kitchen table seances, hoping to contact deceased relatives. Wealthy socialites hosted elaborate spirit communications in their parlors. Intellectuals, including chemist William Crookes, philosopher William James, and author Arthur Conan Doyle, investigated mediumistic phenomena and often became convinced of their reality. The connection between spiritualism and Halloween emerged organically from the movement's theological framework. Spiritualists believed that while communication with the dead was always possible through sufficiently developed mediums, certain times and conditions facilitated easier contact. The traditional belief that the veil between worlds thinned at specific calendar moments resonated deeply with spiritualist theory. If the boundary between the living and the dead became more permeable at particular times, then those times would be optimal for attempted communications. Halloween, with its ancient associations with death, the deceased, and permeability between worlds, became spiritualism's most important calendar moment. Historical records, including spiritualist periodicals, memoirs of prominent mediums, and reports of seance activities, document how Halloween seances became widespread practice throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These are documented historical facts, not folklore or speculation. We have advertisements for Halloween seances, accounts of their procedures, testimonials from participants, and critical investigations by skeptics. The typical Victorian Halloween séance followed specific protocols that bear remarkable similarity to much older ritual patterns, though participants often weren't consciously aware of these connections. Groups gathered in darkened rooms, creating the sensory deprivation conditions that, as we've discussed, alter consciousness and heighten perception of subtle stimuli. Participants sat around tables, often holding hands to create an unbroken circle, mimicking protective circles found in various magical traditions. A medium, usually a woman, since Victorian spiritualist theory held that feminine nature was more receptive to spiritual communications, would enter a trance state. What followed varied, depending on the medium's specialty and the spirits who allegedly manifested. Some seances featured table turning, where the table around which participants sat would tilt, rock, or move in ways apparently impossible through normal physical means. The table's movements could spell out messages through a code of knocks or tilts. Other seances involved automatic writing, where the medium's hand would write messages while she remained in trance, allegedly controlled by spirit entities. Trumpet seances used metal cones through which spirit voices would speak. Full-form materializations claimed to produce visible, tangible spirit bodies from ectoplasm, a mysterious substance the medium's body supposedly generated. The historical record contains thousands of documented accounts of these seances. What that record cannot conclusively establish is whether any genuine supernatural phenomena occurred. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882 by Cambridge scholars, including Henry Sidgwick and Edmund Gurney, spent decades systematically investigating mediumistic claims. Their findings, published in extensive proceedings that remain valuable historical documents, revealed massive amounts of fraud. Mediums used hidden accomplices, trick devices, phosphorescent paint, concealed tools for producing wrappings, and numerous other techniques to fake supernatural phenomena. However, the SPR investigators also documented cases they could not easily explain through known fraudulent methods. These problematic cases, a small fraction of total investigations, kept the question of genuine mediumistic abilities perpetually unresolved. Skeptics argued undiscovered fraud or experimental error. Believers argued the evidence proved survival. The debate continues among researchers even today, though mainstream scientific consensus heavily favors the fraud explanation. What matters for our investigation is not whether Victorian seances successfully contacted the dead, but how spiritualism transformed Halloween's cultural meaning. The movement reframed November's beginning as the optimal time for attempting direct, empirical verification of survival after death. Halloween shifted from a Christian holy day or folk festival to an experimental opportunity for testing whether consciousness persists beyond bodily death. This transformation particularly affected how Halloween was celebrated in domestic contexts. Victorian parlour culture, the custom of gathering friends and family in home parlours for entertainment, absorbed spiritualist practices and Halloween timing to create hybrid forms still recognisable in modern Halloween parties. Historical sources, including women's magazines, etiquette manuals, and personal diaries, document the explosion of Halloween parties during the late 19th century, featuring activities derived from or inspired by spiritualist practices. The games played at these parties often had genuine divinatory origins in Celtic or other folk traditions, though Victorian participants increasingly approached them as entertainment rather than serious magic. Apple bobbing, one of the most enduring Halloween party games, descends from Celtic Samhain divination practices. The game involved floating apples in water or hanging them from strings, and participants attempted to catch them using only their mouths. In original forms documented in Scottish and Irish folklore, success or failure predicted romantic fortune. The first person to catch an apple would be first to marry. Peeling an apple in one continuous strip and tossing the peel over your shoulder would supposedly form the initial of your future spouse. Placing apple seeds named for potential suitors on hot coals would indicate true love by which seed popped most dramatically. These practices represented genuine folk magic traditions, methods rural communities had maintained for centuries to glimpse future outcomes, particularly regarding marriage and death, the two most important life transitions. Victorian Halloween parties appropriated these practices but gradually stripped away their serious magical intent, transforming divination into parlour games. Yet the structure remained. Halloween was a liminal time when normally hidden information about the future might become accessible through specific ritual actions. Mirror divination provides another example. Scottish folklore, documented in multiple 19th century collections, describes how unmarried women would sit before mirrors at midnight on Samhain, eating an apple while brushing their hair. If performed correctly, the face of their future husband would appear in the mirror behind them. This practice derives from older folk magic traditions about mirrors as threshold objects capable of revealing hidden information. Victorian Halloween parties included variants of this game, though increasingly framed as entertainment rather than serious divination. The practice becomes particularly interesting when you recognise that mirror gazing in darkened rooms, regardless of belief in supernatural revelations, does produce consistent psychological phenomena. Extended staring at one's reflection in low light conditions causes perceptual distortions. The brain's face recognition systems begin producing false patterns. People report seeing their faces transform, seeing different faces appear, or experiencing profound alterations in self-perception. This is documented psychological phenomenon, not supernatural occurrence, but it produces experiences that feel genuinely uncanny. Whether Victorian practitioners knew the psychological mechanisms, or whether they interpreted these predictable perceptual effects as supernatural revelations, the practice worked in the sense of producing powerful experiences that validated belief in Halloween's special properties. The same applies to many Victorian Halloween divination games. They employed sensory manipulation, suggestion, altered consciousness states, and ambiguous stimuli to produce experiences that felt magical, regardless of whether any actual supernatural forces were involved. Spiritualist influence on Victorian Halloween went beyond seances and divination games to shape the holiday's visual aesthetic. The imagery we now associate with Halloween, ghosts, skeletons, graveyards, haunted houses, crystallized during this period. Publishers produced enormous quantities of Halloween greeting cards featuring these motifs. These cards, thousands of which survive in historical collections, reveal fascinating cultural attitudes toward death and the supernatural. Many Victorian Halloween cards depicted cute, almost friendly ghosts and skeletons. Death imagery was sanitized, made decorative and entertaining rather than terrifying. This represented significant shift from earlier attitudes. Medieval European culture, and to some extent early modern culture, treated death with profound seriousness. The dance of death motif showed skeletons dragging away living victims of all social classes. Memento mori objects reminded viewers of mortality's inevitability, but Victorian Halloween cards, while using death imagery, often portrayed it in whimsical, unthreatening ways. This transformation reflected several cultural shifts. First, declining childhood mortality rates and increasing life expectancy in industrialized nations created populations less intimately familiar with death. People in Victorian cities experienced death far less frequently than their rural ancestors. Second, spiritualism's optimistic theology promised that death wasn't terrible termination, but transition to continued existence in pleasant spirit realms. Third, the commercialization of holidays incentivized creating appealing products, and terrifying death imagery wouldn't sell as effectively as charming decorative pieces. The result was the sanitization of death, the process of making mortality's imagery decorative rather than confrontational. Halloween became increasingly a holiday about pretend death, decorative death, death as entertainment rather than as the fundamental existential reality it had been for earlier cultures. This sanitization would accelerate throughout the 20th century, until contemporary Halloween almost completely severs connections to genuine contemplation of mortality. The question of spiritualism's relationship to earlier magical traditions deserves examination. Many spiritualist leaders claimed no connection to pre-Christian paganism or folk magic. They positioned spiritualism as modern, scientific, and progressive. Yet the practices they developed often paralleled much older patterns. The darkened seance room echoed the deliberate darkness of Samhain fire-extinguishing rituals. The circle of linked hands resembled protective circles in various magical traditions. The liminal midnight timing matched countless folk magic prescriptions. The emphasis on Halloween as particularly powerful for spirit communication directly continued Celtic beliefs about Samhain's thinned veil. Whether these similarities resulted from unconscious cultural transmission of ancient patterns, from independent discovery of practices that genuinely facilitate altered consciousness states, or from deliberate revival of older techniques, by practitioners more knowledgeable about magical history than they publicly acknowledged, remains uncertain. What's clear is that spiritualism, despite its modern framing, preserved and popularized patterns of behavior remarkably similar to pre-Christian practices Christianity had spent centuries attempting to suppress. The movement's gender dynamics also deserve attention. Spiritualism offered unusual opportunities for women in Victorian society. While denied access to most professional positions and religious leadership roles, women could become mediums, achieving status, income, and authority through their supposed spiritual gifts. The majority of prominent spiritualist mediums were women. This created complex dynamics where marginalized individuals claimed power through alleged supernatural abilities, sometimes fraudulent, but sometimes apparently genuine, in ways investigators couldn't fully explain. Some feminist historians interpret Victorian spiritualism as proto-feminist movement, offering women agency and voice in patriarchal culture. Others note how the movement reinforced gender stereotypes, positioning women as passive vessels for spirits rather than active agents. Both interpretations contain truth. Spiritualism did provide opportunities while also constraining them within acceptable gender frameworks. The decline of spiritualism as dominant cultural force began in the early 20th century. Extensive fraud exposures damaged the movement's credibility. Scientific materialism grew stronger, offering explanations for phenomena spiritualism attributed to supernatural causes. World War I's devastating casualties created cultural exhaustion with death, making continued focus on communicating with the deceased psychologically difficult for populations who had lost millions. By the 1930s, spiritualism had shifted from mainstream movement to niche practice, maintained by committed believers, but no longer commanding widespread cultural attention. Yet spiritualism's influence on Halloween proved durable. The association between Halloween and spirit communication, established during the late 19th century, persists today. Contemporary Halloween maintains emphasis on ghosts, on the dead, on possibilities of supernatural encounters, all legacies of spiritualism's transformation of the holiday. Modern Halloween parties still feature activities descended from Victorian séance games, though participants typically have no conscious awareness of these origins. The question we must ask: did Victorian spiritualism discover genuine methods for communicating with the dead? Methods that remain available if we're willing to seriously engage them? Or did spiritualism create elaborate cultural theatre that felt meaningful to participants, but accomplished no actual contact with deceased consciousness? The historical record cannot definitively answer this question. We can document what people believed, what they experienced, what investigators found when they examined claims. We cannot verify or falsify the fundamental claim that consciousness survives death and can communicate with the living. What we can say with certainty is that millions of people across multiple decades conducted their lives as though these communications were real. They organized religious movements, dedicated resources, structured calendar observances, and made important decisions based on supposed messages from the dead. Whether this represents massive delusion, genuine contact with disembodied consciousness, or complex psychological and sociological phenomena that our current frameworks inadequately conceptualize, remains actively debated. The Victorian transformation of Halloween from Christian Holy Day to séance season represents another layer in the holiday's accumulation of meanings. Halloween carries pre-Christian Celtic associations with death and the other world. Christian theological frameworks about saints and souls in purgatory, and spiritualist beliefs about empirical evidence of survival. Each layer adds complexity while often obscuring earlier meanings. Contemporary Halloween inherits all these accumulated associations, though most celebrants remain unconscious of the depth and complexity. Children trick-or-treating don't know they're enacting patterns related to Celtic guising and Christian soul-caking and Victorian parlour games. Adults decorating with ghosts and skeletons don't recognise they're perpetuating imagery popularised by spiritualist culture. The behaviours persist across radical shifts in belief systems because they address fundamental human needs that transcend specific theological frameworks. Before we examine how modern commercialization has transformed Halloween yet again, engage with our community of investigators. Have you ever participated in seances or attempted communication with the deceased? If so, did you experience phenomena that seemed genuinely anomalous? Or do you interpret your experiences as psychological rather than supernatural? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This investigation thrives on honest testimony rather than comfortable dismissal of difficult questions. Subscribe if this exploration of how cultural movements transform ancient traditions resonates with you. Share this investigation with those interested in how Halloween evolved from Celtic Death Festival to Christian Holy Day to spiritualist seance season. Each transformation preserved elements while adding new layers of meaning, creating the complex, contradictory holiday we celebrate today, often without recognizing the accumulated history embodied in every jack-o'-lantern and costume. The Victorian seance rooms are empty now. The mediums have passed into whatever realm awaits the dead, but their influence on Halloween remains, ensuring that every October 31st, millions of people engage with imagery and activities derived from the spiritualist conviction that death doesn't end consciousness, and the living might contact those who have crossed beyond the veil. Whether that conviction was true, false, or something more complicated than simple truth or falsehood, the cultural patterns it established continue to shape how we acknowledge mortality and contemplate what lies beyond the boundary every human will eventually cross. Chapter 8: Modern Halloween: What We Lost and What Persists. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. Throughout the early decades of the 20th century, Halloween remained a community celebration with regional variations, folk customs maintained through cultural memory, children's pranks that sometimes escalated to vandalism, and lingering traces of the divinatory and spiritual practices we've examined. Then, in the span of roughly 3 decades from the 1930s through the 1950s, American commercial culture systematically transformed Halloween into something unprecedented in the holiday's 2,000-year history, a purely commercial celebration almost completely severed from death's reality, focused on children rather than community, and structured around consumption rather than ritual. This represents documented historical fact. We can trace this transformation through advertising archives, corporate records, popular media, and ethnographic studies, documenting how Halloween practices changed across these decades. What we're examining isn't speculation or theory, but observable cultural shift with identifiable causes and measurable effects. The commercialization began with greeting card companies. During the Victorian period, as we discussed, publishers produced Halloween cards featuring ghosts, witches, and death imagery. But these were niche products, purchased by educated middle and upper classes. The mass production and marketing of Halloween merchandise to general populations began in earnest during the 1920s and accelerated through subsequent decades. Companies including Hallmark, founded in 1910, recognized Halloween's commercial potential. They produced cards, decorations, and party supplies designed to make Halloween celebration easier and more standardized. The economic logic was straightforward. If you could convince families that proper Halloween observance required purchased products rather than homemade items and traditional practices, you created profitable market where none previously existed. The costume industry provides clear example. Historical records document how, before commercialization, Halloween disguises were created at home using available materials. Children and adults constructed costumes from old clothes, sheets, face paint made from ash or other household substances, and whatever materials they could improvise. These homemade disguises connected to older guising traditions through the labor and creativity required to produce them. Making your own costume was itself ritual act. transformation through creative effort. Commercial costume manufacturing changed this completely. The Ben Cooper Company, founded in 1937, became the dominant Halloween costume manufacturer for decades. They produced masks and costumes featuring licensed characters from popular culture, initially cartoon figures, and later television and movie characters. These mass-produced costumes required no creativity, no labor, no personal transformation through making. You purchased pre-packaged identity and wore it. Now, we must be careful not to romanticize the past while demonizing commercial culture. Commercially produced costumes made Halloween participation accessible to families lacking time, skills, or resources for elaborate homemade disguises. They democratized access in certain ways. Children from working-class families could wear costumes as impressive as those from wealthier families if both were store-bought. However, something was undeniably lost in this exchange: the transformative process of creating your own disguise, the connection to traditions of craft and making, the personal investment that distinguished your costume as uniquely yours rather than identical to thousands of others. The trick-or-treat practice, now so central to American Halloween that many people assume it's ancient tradition, actually achieved its current standardized form quite recently. Historical documentation reveals complex evolution. The practice has roots in Celtic guising, Christian soul-caking, and various folk customs where costumed individuals traveled house to house receiving offerings. But the specific modern American form, children in commercial costumes going door to door saying trick or treat and receiving individually wrapped candy, emerged and standardized primarily during the 1950s. Several factors drove this standardization. Post-World War II suburban development created neighborhoods with many houses in close proximity, making door-to-door visits practical. The baby boom produced large populations of children. Candy manufacturers recognized commercial opportunity and actively promoted Halloween as candy-giving occasion. Popular media, particularly television, depicted trick-or-treating in standardized ways that influenced how communities practiced it. The trick component, threatening mischief if treats aren't provided, descends from older traditions where failing to honor ritual obligations risked supernatural or social consequences. But in modern practice, this has become purely formulaic. Children don't actually threaten or perform tricks. The phrase is ritual utterance, repeated because tradition dictates it, but emptied of original meaning about genuine consequences for failing to honor the exchange. The candy industry's role in shaping modern Halloween deserves particular attention. This is documented historical fact, not conspiracy theory. Candy manufacturers, including Hershey's, Mars, and others, recognized Halloween's potential as major candy consumption occasion. They developed marketing campaigns, produced Halloween-specific products, and worked to establish candy giving as standard practice. Trade publications and marketing materials from these companies explicitly discuss strategies for expanding Halloween candy sales. The shift from homemade treats to pre-packaged candy accelerated during the 1970s and 1980s, driven partially by urban legends about poisoned candy and razor blades in apples. These fears, largely unfounded according to sociological research, nonetheless transformed practice. Joel Best, a sociologist at University of Delaware, studied Halloween candy tampering claims extensively and found almost no verified cases of strangers harming children through trick-or-treat candy. The few documented cases involve family members rather than random poisoners. Yet the fear persisted and reshaped behavior. The result, homemade treats, which had connected Halloween to older traditions of food preparation and offering, became socially unacceptable. Only factory-sealed, commercially produced candy was considered safe. This completed Halloween's transformation into pure commercial transaction. The exchange lost any remaining connection to ritual feeding of spirits or community reciprocity and became simple candy distribution to costume children. The sanitization of death imagery represents another crucial aspect of Halloween's modern transformation. Victorian Halloween, as we discussed, had already begun making death decorative rather than confrontational. But 20th century commercialization accelerated this process until contemporary Halloween almost completely severs connection to genuine contemplation of mortality. Modern Halloween decorations feature cartoon ghosts, friendly skeletons, and cute monsters. Death imagery is rendered harmless, even charming. This reflects broader cultural death denial. Modern industrial societies, particularly the United States, treat death with sanitized distance unprecedented in human history. We outsource dying to hospitals and nursing homes. We delegate death management to funeral industry professionals. We replace sustained mourning with brief memorial services before returning to productivity. We speak of death in euphemisms: passed away, lost, no longer with us, anything to avoid directly naming death's reality. Halloween, which originated as explicitly death-focused observance, now functions as celebration where death imagery appears, but death's reality is carefully avoided. Children dress as skeletons without contemplating that they will become skeletons. Families decorate with tombstones without reflecting on their own mortality. The imagery persists, but meaning evaporates. This transformation has psychological costs that researchers are only beginning to fully document. Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, published in 1973, argued that modern culture's systematic denial of mortality creates profound anxiety that manifests in various destructive ways. Becker synthesized anthropological, psychological, and philosophical research to demonstrate how cultural frameworks for managing death anxiety shape virtually all human behavior. His work, which won the Pulitzer Prize, suggests that cultures lacking robust frameworks for acknowledging and integrating mortality produce populations with elevated existential anxiety, displaced fears, and difficulty finding meaning. Contemporary psychological research supports Becker's thesis. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky, based on Becker's work, has generated hundreds of empirical studies demonstrating how mortality awareness influences behavior, attitudes, and cognition. Their research shows that when people are reminded of death, even subliminally, they exhibit predictable changes in worldview defense, materialism, prejudice, and various other domains. The implications for Halloween are significant. The holiday represents an annual cultural moment when death imagery becomes ubiquitous. For most of the year, modern culture successfully maintains death denial, but Halloween briefly surfaces death symbolism, though in sanitized form. This creates tension. The imagery triggers mortality awareness, but the sanitized presentation provides no meaningful frameworks for processing that awareness. The result may be elevation of anxiety without corresponding ritual or conceptual tools for managing it. Contrast this with Celtic Samhain practices, which confronted death directly through elaborate rituals, providing community support, theological frameworks, and practical actions for managing mortality anxiety. The Dumb Supper allowed families to maintain relationships with deceased relatives. The fire extinguishing ritual created shared vulnerability and renewal. The protective protocols gave people concrete actions for managing supernatural threats, real or imagined. Whether these practices addressed objective spiritual realities or served purely psychological functions, they provided technologies for processing death anxiety that modern Halloween completely lacks. The question becomes, should we lament Halloween's transformation or celebrate its evolution into family-friendly entertainment? The answer depends on whether we believe the older practices served functions beyond entertainment. If Samhain and its descendants were merely quaint customs, with no real psychological or spiritual efficacy, then modern commercial Halloween represents harmless or even beneficial evolution, making the holiday accessible, safe, and fun for children without burdening them with frightening contemplation of mortality. But if the original practices encoded sophisticated technologies for managing consciousness, for negotiating with psychological forces, for maintaining community cohesion through shared ritual confrontation with fundamental existential realities, then their commercialization represents genuine loss. We've gained convenient, profitable, standardized celebration while losing ritual technologies our ancestors developed through millennia of careful observation. The neo-pagan movement represents one response to this perceived loss. Beginning in the mid-20th century and accelerating from the 1970s onward, various groups attempted to recover and reconstruct pre-Christian spiritual practices. Modern paganism, Wicca, Druidry, and related movements look to historical sources we've examined throughout this investigation: the medieval Irish manuscripts, the ethnographic studies, the folklore collections, and attempt to rebuild living spiritual traditions from these fragments. These movements face enormous obstacles. The original belief frameworks are largely lost. We have records of practices but limited understanding of the consciousness states and theological assumptions that gave those practices meaning. Light pollution eliminates the true darkness Celtic peoples knew intimately. Urban noise prevents profound silence. Legal and ethical frameworks prohibit practices like animal sacrifice that some traditions considered essential. Most significantly, modern consciousness itself differs from ancient consciousness in ways that make genuine recovery of ancient practices perhaps impossible. Contemporary pagans generally acknowledge these limitations. Most don't claim to practice ancient Celtic religion exactly as it existed. Instead, they're creating new traditions inspired by historical sources, but adapted to contemporary contexts. Whether these reconstructed practices achieve anything comparable to what ancient rituals accomplished remains uncertain. Participants often report meaningful experiences, but whether these represent recovery of ancient wisdom or creation of new meaningful practices from historical inspiration is open question. Some neo-pagan groups observe Samhain with considerable seriousness, performing dumb suppers, maintaining vigils, conducting elaborate rituals, acknowledging death, and honoring ancestors. These observances bear superficial resemblance to historical practices we've examined, but the participants live in a fundamentally different world than ancient Celts. They can temporarily extinguish electric lights, but cannot experience true darkness of pre-industrial night. They can gather in circles, but cannot escape ambient noise of modern life. They can perform rituals, but cannot fully inhabit the consciousness that gave those rituals original meaning. Yet perhaps something valuable persists, even in imperfect reconstruction. If the practices addressed real psychological needs, managing grief, confronting mortality, creating community bonds, then modern versions might serve similar functions, even without perfect historical continuity. The question isn't whether contemporary pagans practice exactly what ancient Celts practiced, which is clearly impossible, but whether their practices address similar human needs through similar ritual technologies. The persistence of Halloween patterns, despite radical transformations in conscious meaning, suggests something durable in the behavioral templates. People continue gathering at October's end. They continue engaging with death imagery, however sanitized. They continue practices involving disguise, darkness, threshold crossing, and community participation. These patterns persist across Celtic paganism, Christian All-Hallowtide, Victorian spiritualism, and modern commercial celebration. The continuity suggests the behaviors address needs deeper than any particular theological framework. Anthropologists and psychologists who study ritual suggest that practices can retain efficacy even when conscious belief is absent. The ritual actions themselves, gathering, marking time, creating special conditions, shared attention, may produce benefits regardless of participants' explicit beliefs about what they're accomplishing. The dumb supper might help families process grief whether or not deceased spirits actually consume the offerings. The costume transformation might facilitate identity exploration whether or not it confuses supernatural entities. The communal celebration might strengthen social bonds whether or not cosmic forces are being honored. This suggests third possibility beyond either believing ancient practices accessed real supernatural forces or dismissing them as pure delusion. Perhaps the practices worked in the pragmatic sense of producing valuable psychological and social effects, regardless of whether supernatural explanations were accurate. The technologies functioned. Whether they functioned for the reasons practitioners believed remains a separate question. Modern Halloween's greatest loss may not be connection to specific ancient beliefs, but abandonment of rituals' communal and psychological functions. Contemporary celebration is increasingly privatized and commercialized. Families purchase decorations and candy rather than creating offerings together. Children trick-or-treat in supervised groups rather than communities gathering for shared observance. The holiday becomes individual consumer choice rather than collective ritual marking important transition. Some communities maintain stronger connections to older patterns. Mexican Dia de Muertos celebrations, which coincide with Halloween and share some historical connections, preserve ancestor-focused observances with living ritual vitality. Families construct elaborate altars, prepare deceased relatives' favorite foods, visit graves to share meals, and maintain genuine belief that the dead return during this time. These practices bear strong resemblance to Celtic Samhain traditions, despite developing in an entirely different cultural context, suggesting convergent evolution, addressing universal human needs around death and remembrance. The question confronting anyone seriously examining Halloween's transformation: can we recover anything valuable from older traditions, or should we accept commercial Halloween as legitimate evolution? Neo-pagans argue for recovery. Commercial interests argue for continued evolution towards safer, more profitable forms. Most people navigate between these positions, participating in commercial Halloween while perhaps maintaining private practices connecting to older meanings. What seems clear is that modern Halloween, for all its commercial success and widespread participation, has lost something our ancestors possessed: robust cultural frameworks for acknowledging death's reality and maintaining relationships with the dead. Whether that loss matters, whether it produces measurable psychological or social costs, whether recovery is possible or desirable, remain open questions without simple answers. Halloween persists as cultural practice 2,000 years after Samhain's origins. The behavioral patterns prove remarkably durable, even as conscious meanings shift radically. People gather, disguise themselves, engage with death imagery, mark the transition between October and November. These patterns address something fundamental in human consciousness. Some need to acknowledge darkness, mortality, and the unknown that persists across vast changes in belief systems. Before we reach our final conclusions about what Halloween's long history reveals, take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with the holiday. Do you participate in Halloween? If so, do you engage with it as pure entertainment, as connection to something deeper, or as complex mixture of both? Have you experienced moments during Halloween celebrations when you felt connected to something beyond commercial spectacle? Share your reflections in the comments below. Subscribe if this investigation into cultural transformation and the loss of ritual technologies resonates with you. Share this with those questioning whether holidays can maintain meaning in commercial age, whether ancient wisdom can be recovered, and whether the behavioral patterns we inherit from ancestors might serve functions we no longer consciously recognize but desperately need. The transformation is complete. The ancient festival of death has become children's dress-up holiday focused on candy consumption. Yet the timing persists. The imagery persists, the gathering persists, and perhaps, beneath commercial overlay and conscious forgetting, something of the original patterns persists, waiting for those willing to look beneath Halloween's cheerful surface to the darker truths about mortality, consciousness, and the thin places where worlds meet, that our ancestors understood far better than our technological civilization prefers to acknowledge. We have journeyed through 2,000 years of deliberately obscured history. We have examined how Celtic communities confronted death directly through sophisticated rituals. We have documented Christianity's strategic appropriation of pagan practices. We have traced Victorian spiritualism's transformation of Halloween into seance season. We have witnessed commercial culture's sanitization of death into entertainment. Now we must confront the question that has haunted this entire investigation. What if the Celts were accurately observing real phenomena? Let me be absolutely clear about what I'm asking. I'm not suggesting we should accept medieval Irish manuscripts as literal historical truth. I'm not claiming spirits definitely exist, or that the veil literally thins on October 31st. What I'm asking is more nuanced and perhaps more disturbing. What if the behaviours and frameworks Celtic peoples developed, regardless of whether their supernatural explanations were objectively accurate, addressed real features of human consciousness, and perhaps reality that our culture has systematically trained itself not to perceive? Consider the evidence we've accumulated throughout this investigation. For over 1,500 years, geographically dispersed Celtic populations maintained consistent traditions about Samhain. These weren't imposed by central authority, but emerged and persisted through decentralized cultural transmission. The practices remained remarkably stable across regions and centuries, despite having no institutional structure enforcing conformity. This suggests the behaviors were addressing something real, some genuine feature of human experience at October's end that made these specific practices compelling across vast populations and time periods. The consistency of the phenomena described is striking. Medieval Irish texts separated by centuries describe similar experiences: temporal distortion near Sid mounds, encounters with entities possessing specific characteristics, effects of protective protocols, consequences of violating taboos. Ethnographic studies from the 19th and 20th centuries document rural Irish and Scottish populations, reporting similar phenomena despite centuries of Christianization. Contemporary accounts from people near ancient sites continue describing comparable experiences: sense of presence, electronic equipment malfunction, temporal strangeness, psychological effects. Now, materialist explanation would attribute all this to cultural transmission of expectations, producing predictable psychological experiences. People believe they'll encounter strange phenomena at ancient sites on Samhain because tradition tells them to expect this, so they interpret ambiguous experiences through that framework. This is entirely plausible explanation and probably accounts for majority of reported experiences. But it doesn't fully explain the persistence across such radical cultural transformations. People in medieval Ireland lived in fundamentally different conceptual universe than people in 19th century Scotland, who differed vastly from contemporary witnesses. Yet the phenomena described maintain troubling consistency. Either we're seeing extraordinarily durable cultural transmission of expectation patterns, or we're seeing consistent responses to genuine features of certain locations and times. The neuroscience of altered consciousness states offers partial framework. We know that specific environmental conditions reliably produce alterations in perception and cognition. Sensory deprivation, like the darkness Celtic peoples deliberately created by extinguishing fires, consistently produces hallucinations and altered states. Rhythmic stimulation, like firelight flickering or repetitive chanting, entrains neural activity in ways that alter consciousness. Suggestion and expectation powerfully influence perception, particularly in ambiguous situations. The Celtic practices, examined from this perspective, represent sophisticated technologies for inducing altered consciousness states. The darkness, the silence, the ritual actions, the community participation all combine to shift participants into consciousness modes where normal boundaries between self and other, between internal and external, become permeable. In these states, experiences that might be dismissed as imagination in ordinary consciousness feel utterly real and can produce lasting psychological effects. But here's where it becomes complicated. Just because we can identify neurological mechanisms doesn't mean we've fully explained the phenomena. Altered consciousness states might not be merely hallucinations, but different modes of perceiving reality. What if the boundaries that normally structure consciousness exist not because they reflect objective reality, but because they're useful fictions for navigating ordinary life? What if loosening those boundaries, as Celtic practices systematically did, allows perception of features of reality normally filtered out? I'm not making definitive claims here. I'm pointing out that our culture's materialist assumptions, while productive for technological development, may prematurely close questions that deserve remaining open. The Celts believed they were observing real phenomena. Millions of people across centuries maintained practices based on those beliefs. Contemporary witnesses continue reporting comparable experiences. Either everyone is deluded by cultural expectations, or our current scientific frameworks are inadequate for phenomena these traditions address. The question of protective rituals becomes particularly urgent if we take seriously the possibility that Celtic peoples were responding to genuine phenomena. They developed elaborate protocols, iron protection, specific herbs, threshold guardians like jack-o'-lanterns, ritual actions, respectful behaviours near certain sites. These weren't arbitrary superstitions, but systematic technologies refined across generations. Modern culture has almost completely abandoned these practices. We've forgotten why jack-o'-lanterns were placed at thresholds. We've lost the knowledge of which sites require respectful distance. We've dismissed the protective protocols as primitive foolishness. But what if those protocols served real protective functions? What if the entities, or forces, or psychological phenomena, whatever terminology we prefer, that these practices managed haven't disappeared just because we've stopped acknowledging them? This isn't meant to induce paranoia. I'm not suggesting everyone should immediately start performing protective rituals. What I'm suggesting is that our culture's confident dismissal of these traditions as mere superstition may represent arrogance rather than enlightenment. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They were responding to their lived experience with sophisticated frameworks, developed through careful observation, dismissing everything they believed as delusion, without seriously investigating whether the behaviours they developed might have addressed real features of consciousness or world, represents failure of intellectual humility. The psychological costs of death denial that we discussed earlier are well documented in scientific literature. Modern industrial societies that lack robust cultural frameworks for acknowledging mortality produce populations with elevated anxiety, difficulty finding meaning, and various other measurable problems. This isn't speculation. This is documented in peer-reviewed research. Celtic Samhain practices, Christian All-Hallowtide, even Victorian spiritualist seances, all provided frameworks for regularly confronting mortality within supportive community structures. These practices may have been based on inaccurate supernatural beliefs, but they functioned as technologies for managing death anxiety and maintaining psychological health around existential questions. Modern commercial Halloween provides no such framework. It surfaces death imagery without providing meaningful ways to process what that imagery represents. We've abandoned the ritual technologies while retaining empty behavioral shells. The result may be holiday that triggers mortality awareness while offering no tools for managing the anxiety that awareness generates. Whether we can recover anything valuable from these lost traditions without embracing supernatural claims we may not believe remains open question. Some possibilities. We might maintain practices like dumb suppers as family grief rituals without believing deceased spirits literally attend. We might create contemporary versions of fire extinguishing and rekindling as community bonding experiences without supernatural theology. We might observe moments of darkness and silence as meditation on mortality without believing we're opening doorways to other worlds. We might maintain respectful behavior near ancient sites, not because we fear fairy abduction, but because these are culturally significant locations deserving reverence. These adapted practices might serve similar psychological and social functions as original versions even without supernatural frameworks. Or they might prove meaningless without genuine belief in supernatural realities, mere cargo cult imitations of practices that worked only within complete cosmological systems. I cannot answer this definitively because the question remains genuinely unresolved. What I can say with confidence is that our culture's relationship with death is profoundly unhealthy, that we've lost ritual technologies our ancestors possessed for managing mortality awareness, and that Halloween represents annual opportunity to recover some of what was lost if we're willing to engage with the holiday as more than commercial spectacle. The persistent patterns we've traced through this investigation, the darkness and light, the disguise and transformation, the honoring of the dead, the acknowledgement of boundaries between worlds growing thin, address something fundamental in human consciousness. These patterns don't disappear just because belief systems change. They persist because they're responding to enduring features of human experience. Whether those features are purely psychological, neurological responses to seasonal transitions and mortality awareness, or whether they reflect genuine metaphysical realities, our scientific frameworks cannot yet accommodate, remains the persistent question. The Celts believed one answer. Modern materialism insists on another. Perhaps wisdom lies in acknowledging we don't actually know. In remaining open to possibilities, our culture has prematurely closed. What we do know is this. For 2,000 years, people have gathered at October's end to acknowledge death, to honor the deceased, to confront the darkness, and to mark the transition between light and dark halves of the year. They've done this through radically different belief systems: pagan, Christian, spiritualist, and secular. The beliefs change, the behaviors persist. That persistence suggests something important, some genuine human need these practices address. Every jack-o'-lantern carries 2,000 years of accumulated meaning, most of it forgotten by the person who carved it. Every costume connects to ancient practices of transformation and protection through disguise. Every piece of candy handed to trick-or-treaters echoes offerings to spirits and souls. The behaviors continue while conscious understanding evaporates. This represents both tragedy and opportunity. Tragedy because we've lost sophisticated cultural technologies our ancestors developed. Opportunity because the behavioral templates persist, waiting to be reinvested with meaning by anyone willing to look beneath commercial surface to the deeper patterns still embedded in Halloween's structure. I don't pretend to have answers. This investigation has accumulated evidence, traced historical transformations, and raised questions that deserve remaining open rather than prematurely closed by either credulous belief or dismissive skepticism. What I hope you've gained is historical knowledge about Halloween's actual origins and transformations, skepticism toward both supernatural claims and materialist dismissals that may be equally premature, and perhaps some sense that the holiday you celebrate each October carries depths of meaning invisible to casual participation. The choice confronting each of us. Do we continue participating in Halloween as pure commercial entertainment, comfortable and safe but ultimately empty? Do we attempt recovery of older practices, risking accusations of superstition or appropriation? Do we create new rituals inspired by ancient patterns but adapted to contemporary consciousness? Or do we abandon the holiday entirely as hopelessly corrupted by commercialization and severed from meaningful origins? There's no single correct answer. The path forward depends on individual beliefs, community contexts, and willingness to engage seriously with questions our culture prefers avoiding. What seems clear is that simply continuing current trajectory, progressive commercial dilution until Halloween becomes pure consumer spectacle, devoid of any connection to mortality, darkness, or genuine mystery, represents loss we should grieve, even if we can't prevent it. The Celts stood in absolute darkness and waited for the veil to thin. They believed the boundaries between worlds dissolved and entities crossed over. They developed elaborate technologies for managing what they encountered. Whether they were responding to objective supernatural realities or to psychological phenomena we still inadequately understand, their practices worked in the sense of providing functional frameworks for acknowledging death, maintaining community, and navigating the darkest time of year. We've lost that darkness. We've forgotten those frameworks. But every October 31st, millions of people unconsciously reenact behavioral patterns 2,000 years old. The rituals persist, encoded in cultural memory, waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. This Halloween, as you encounter jack-o'-lanterns and costumes and candy, as you participate in commercial celebration, largely empty of conscious meaning, remember what lies beneath. Remember the darkness the Celts knew. Remember the dead they honoured. Remember the boundaries they believed grew thin. Remember the technologies they developed. You don't have to believe what they believed. But perhaps, just perhaps, you might acknowledge that they were responding to something real, something our culture has lost the ability to perceive but that nonetheless persists, waiting in the darkness beyond our well-lit streets, in the silence beneath our constant noise, in the depths beneath commercial surface. The veil grows thin. It has always grown thin. And the question remains, what waits on the other side? The Celts thought they knew. We've forgotten. But every Halloween, whether we recognize it or not, we stand at the threshold they mapped so carefully, and something, psychological or ontological, ancestral or alien, remembered or forgotten, presses close against the boundary, waiting to cross over. Thank you for joining this investigation into the shadows. Subscribe for future journeys into territories where history, folklore, psychology, and perhaps something stranger intertwine. Share this with those brave enough to question comfortable assumptions about what Halloween really commemorates. And this October 31st, when you light your jack-o'-lantern, perhaps spare a thought for why you're really doing it, what ancient protection you're unconsciously maintaining, what forces you're unknowingly acknowledging. The darkness is waiting. It waits every year. And perhaps, just perhaps, something waits within it.